Okay. So the first 2 days were recorded and then posted after being recorded. They were not official live streams, so therefore they show up under the video heading right here, days 1 and 2. And then all the other days, because I'm doing them as live streams, are showing up under the live heading right there. And then if I do something like I did the other day, like a question and answer kind of a thing where I just answered something that someone asked in Notion, then that, or an email, that'll show up probably in the live stream, or it might be a written out answer that I'll just post in Notion itself. Don't forget Notion, if you haven't already, be sure to go over there so I know that you're seeing it, and post a little comment, even just a wave or something, so I can make sure if you're not able to access Notion, let me know, because I'm posting material content as needed. Someone asked about practice exams, and there are, I believe, about 4. There's a first quarter of the course practice exam that I'll be giving you pretty soon, probably next week. And then there's a midterm, and there's a 3/4 of the way, and then there's a I think there might be one more. I've got them ready to go, but right now you don't know enough of the content to have a decent, for it to do you much good, right? So we'll be releasing those pretty soon, the first one pretty soon. We've got your study guide available. Don't forget that in the Google Drive so that you can kind of see what's coming up next. We left off with chapter 6. We're going to finish that up tonight, and then we're going to get into environmental issues, which is textbook unit 20, syllabus section 6. It's a quick one. It's pretty fast. We're going to talk about lead-based paint and asbestos and all that fun stuff. And then we'll probably get on into brokerage. We did a review of the license law and commission rules, section D. It's actually section 21 in the syllabus, but then subsection D in the syllabus. And then after the next couple of weeks, after Thanksgiving, we'll cover the next 2 subsections in the syllabus of the license law and commission rules. My goal is to have covered all of it in class by the time we get to the normal part in the syllabus, right? We would normally be covering it right after Christmas, but by then I want us to just be able to do a good solid review of it, because it's that important. And it's the most common one out of the national and state portions of the exam. It's the one that people struggle with the most. If people fail one of the 2 parts, it's probably the state section that they fail more than the national section. We covered in, let me see here, in unit 4, we talked about acreage to square footage conversions. So let's do a real quick recap of that. First of all, let me share this with you. Here we go. We talked about the basically simple geometry for determining acreage and square footage of a lot. For pre-licensing, they're not giving you any more advanced shapes than this. You're not going to have to use calculus and figure out curves and any sort of more complex shapes than just length times width equals area. So that's what this looks like. The width in this case is the street frontage, 325 feet of street frontage or front feet. And then the depth of the lot was 157. Multiplying them together gives you the square footage of that lot. Well, if you're like me and you've done some searches online and noticed how land is reported, the size of land is given not in square feet so much, but in acreage. There are some commercial type websites, you'll see it from time to time that they refer to land in square feet, but by far, especially in residential real estate, it will be an acreage measurement. How many acres is that lot? And it'll be 0.5 or half an acre or 1.27. But if you know the lot dimensions, you're going to first get the square footage of that lot. And in this case, it's 51,025 square feet. And last night we learned that how many square feet in an acre can be remembered. You're going to need to remember that. You're going to need to have it in your memory for the test just so that you can manipulate this conversion back and forth. And the best way to remember it is 4 little old ladies driving 35 miles an hour in a 60-mile-an-hour zone, 43,560 square feet, or in an acre. So we take that 51,025 and divide it by the 43,560, and that shows us that this lot of 325 by 157 is actually 1.17 acres. But that's not all, right? Sound like an infomercial now. We probably are going to need to take this a step further and actually use the information to calculate how much the piece of land is worth, right? It all starts with the acreage, but we also need to find out how much is it selling for per acre. And according to this problem, land costs $14,500 per acre. So how much would this particular parcel sell for? And if you want it in the form of a T formula or circle formula, look on the left. The value, dollar value of the lot equals the cost per acre times the number of acres. You could probably all have figured that out on your own, right? That's just Amazon 1.0. Anytime you're shopping, you kind of know that a dollar per something times how many of the thing equals how much it's going to cost. So it's not much different than that. And in this case, we multiply 1.17 acres times $14,500 per acre. And it tells us that this lot should be worth about $16,965. Reminder that there's 2 different types of reporting the size. In certain problems, they might not ask you for square feet or acres. They might ask you for front footage. The test question might talk about front feet, and that's something that pops up in commercial real estate. It's what we learned last night. And in this case, the front footage is 325 feet. That's how much is against the street or the road. That's more valuable than the square footage when it's a commercial use, because it's all about that exposure to the drive-by traffic kind of thing. So there is our conversion. Just be able to go back and forth and manipulate that acre to square footage, and then also price per acre concept. We also talked about excise tax, since we're talking about math right now. And what was the formula for excise tax? Anybody remember?
I say $1 for every 500.
You got it. Exactly right. That's the formula now. Someday that might change, right? It's a tax. It's basically sort of a sales tax. Who traditionally pays the excise tax as far as we're concerned in this class? The seller. That's a seller expense. When we get to Unit 21 about closing procedures and closing math, you're going to be learning who is responsible for the various fees associated with a closing. And this is one that the seller is responsible for. Another one the seller's responsible for is what? Give me a wild guess. What else does the seller have to pay at a closing? It's simple. It's the biggest number. It's probably easier than than you think. The commission, right? Commission. What about the buyer? A big number the buyer has to pay is the price, the sales price, right? So that's the sort of thing we'll cover in Unit 21. There's not many expenses as far as how many line item expenses there are that the seller is responsible for. Not to say that the dollar amount wouldn't add up to more than what the buyer has to pay, maybe, but seller's responsible for just a handful of things. We'll see that the buyer's responsible for a whole lot of things. And excise tax, that's where I left off, is one of them. We'll pick back up here, but let's look at that real quick. Excise tax is, Okay, there we go. $1 per $500 of sale price. That's the other thing. It's sales price, not tax value, right? Just because you see the word tax, don't think that means it's always about the tax value. Excise tax is $1 per 500 of sale price. Once I get my act together here with this iPad. All right, there we go. $1 per $500 of sales price. So if the problem says the property sold for $834,000, actually let me make it a little more challenging. $834,000. If I can write a 3. $716 is the sales price. $834,716. How much is that seller responsible for in terms of excise tax? There were two methods we could use to determine this. Step 1. If it's $1 per 500, then we're just going to divide this sales price by 500. 834,716 divided by 500. And that gives us this number with some change. And so that's the other little caveat to excise tax. Ignore the change. Round up. So we're just going to round up to 1670. That's how much the seller will be charged for excise tax. I like that method better. It's up to you. The other method would be rounding the actual sales price first before doing the division. In that event, you're going to round these last three figures to the next $500 increment. So that would mean this would be $835,000 divided by the 500. And that is going to give you the exact amount for excise tax without having to round anymore. You've already done the rounding, right? There's that 1670. You did the rounding up front of the sales price. So whichever one is more comfortable to you, right? Whether you're rounding the sale price or rounding the number you get after the fact, pick a method that feels good to you and stick with that. Okay. Now let's pick up where we left off last night. We talked about septic tanks. Our best friend, the septic tank. It is our best friend if what we're doing is if we don't have access to the city sewer system, because that's the only way we can have a working bathroom. And these country houses or houses that maybe are older use septic systems. And so as brokers, what we are responsible for is to report the number of bedrooms, not necessarily that the house looks like it has, but that the septic permit says it has. Because that septic permit is going to tell how many bedrooms this septic system is capable of supporting, right? When you pump that wastewater out of the house and into the tank, it goes into this big cement box first, and then from that box it goes out into various leach fields. In fact, it looks kind of like this. If you pull a septic permit, which is pretty easy, you just call up the local health department in the county the property is located. Anybody could do it. They don't ask who you are. You just say, I would like to see the septic permit for this address. Okay, they'll say, what's your email address? And probably within the day they'll send it to you. But it's going to have some facts about the property kind of written at the top of the page. It's just one page usually. Then it'll have a section probably at the bottom that's like grid lines. And somebody who inspected this someday, once upon a time, will have drawn out by hand some image of the house, and then they'll show where that septic tank is in relation to the house. This is the front of the house, that's the street. The tank is here, and they'll just show how it's laid out. And so from that point, they'll show that the leach fields, which are basically large black corrugated pipes that might be as much as 100 feet long or more, and there might be 3 or 4 or 5 of them. It depends on how big the house is that the septic system needs to support. When this owner built the house, they might have said, I want to build a 5-bedroom house, so I need a septic system that supports a 5-bedroom house. So the septic specialists needed to do some math and figure out, okay, how many leach fields, what size system do we need in order to support that many adults in a house? It's not number of bathrooms. That could be a test question, by the way. What is the method of determining a septic system for a property? Number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, square footage. It could be things like that. Your answer there is number of bedrooms, because the idea is for every bedroom there are 2 adults who could be living in that house. And so a 4-bedroom house would be potentially 4 times 2 or 8 adults worth of wastewater being produced from that household into that septic system. So it's surprising how messy this actual septic permit is, and it just looks like it's hand drawn, but it shows somewhere up in this information up top that it perks for a 4-bedroom house, and you'll just need to find that number for which the septic system perks. How many bedrooms is the main gist of that. Okay, as brokers, we need to ask that question. We cannot. The example I gave last night was this one. It's actually a firsthand, real-world example. A guy I went to school with hired me to list his house, and he had a 3-bedroom brick ranch house with a full basement. And over the years that they owned it, they finished out that basement. It was unfinished, and he finished it all out, put a home theater, a billiards room, a family room, a little kitchenette, and 2 big bedrooms and 2 full bathrooms for his teenage sons. Well, he wanted to call the house a 5-bedroom house, 3 on the main level and then 2 more in the basement. But I had to explain this to him. My first question to him was, what? Are you on the city sewer system, or do you have a septic tank? And he said, oh, they don't have city sewer lines out here. We're on a septic tank. My next question was, do you happen to know how many bedrooms your tank perks for? And he did not. So I had to contact the health department. I said, please email me your septic permit. And I learned that it was perking for a 3-bedroom home. So I explained to him, look, I can't market it as a 5-bedroom home. I have to only market it as a 3-bedroom because that's the only number of bedrooms your septic system is officially sized for. So we talked about how great the basement was, but I didn't call any of those rooms bedrooms. I just said we had lots of rooms down there. We had a theater and we had bonus rooms. You just can't call them bedrooms. Now, if he did have city sewer lines available at the street, running under the pavement at the street that he could have tapped onto, and he insisted on me marketing the house as a 5-bedroom home, I would have said, okay, fine, then pay to tap onto the city system, and I can market this as a 5-bedroom home, because now the septic system isn't used anymore. It doesn't matter because you're connected to the city sewer. So it only matters for the septic system. We talked about the difference between publicly and privately maintained roads, and how it's, as brokers, we're responsible for finding out, is the road this house is on public or private. So when the developer builds the development, makes the roads, they need to build the road to the specifications of the DOT, Department of Transportation, and there it is, and then ask the DOT, petition them to please accept or take over these roads for public maintenance. You guys are going to take care of these now, not us, at some point in the building process. And then you're not done. Not only do you ask the DOT to do this, but you have to get acceptance from the DOT that they agree. they're going to send somebody out. They're going to make sure those roads were built properly to the standards set by the DOT. And then once all that works and passes, now you have a publicly maintained road. Another little element of this issue is publicly maintained roads need to be accessible by the public. So when you see a gated community, are those roads public or private? That's right. So gated community roads are privately maintained, and that's part of those HOA fees probably. They're paying to keep them maintained, and potholes just develop, right? And repaving and filling potholes is expensive. So selling a house to your buyer, and if your buyer were not to realize that this is a privately maintained road and then find out a year or 5 years after you sell it to them that now they're responsible, they and their neighbors have to pay to get the road repaved, bad for the broker. They would probably come back and make a complaint and possibly sue over it. That is something that we need to disclose as brokers so as not to have an expensive situation like that. Another thing we talked about was the number of lots that a property is divided into in order to be classified as a subdivision. What's that magic number? Surprisingly few. What was that number?
2 or more.
Yeah, at least 2. If you just divide the piece of land into 2 or more, now it has to follow subdivision regulations. So what does that mean? It means the developer needs to tell people what's going on there, right? Needs to prepare a preliminary plan where they are creating a preliminary plat map for that matter and showing how everything's laid out with each other, all the lots, where they're positioned, how big they each are. If you've ever been to new construction model home and talked to a new construction sales person, do that. If you have spare time, if you drive by a new construction community, go in there. Talk to them. Just let them know that if you don't want to waste their time, just say, look, I'm studying for my real estate license. I just wanted to come in, take a look around, see the product. And they'll probably still be nice to you and let you kind of walk around. And you'll see a map somewhere. It's not the official plat map. It's their sales demonstration map, probably on a big island in the middle of the room or on the wall. And that's where they're going to show you all the red flags or notification or symbols that they have sold these lots, but not this lot. This one's still for sale. And ask them what the lot premiums are. That's interesting to know. They usually charge extra for a corner lot or a subdivision lot because it's bigger. It's always interesting to me that the builder developer charges a premium for corner lots, but on the resale market, if you place that house in a weird way, like angled or catty-cornered, it kind of kills the backyard. It doesn't necessarily translate to getting that money back on the resale. So I'm not a huge fan of corner lots as far as for my client's best interest. It needs to be planned right. It needs to be big enough to still have usable space. But it's fun to go in there and kind of see what's what and see the decor. They spend $100,000 to decorate some of these model homes. Somebody has picked the perfect colors, the perfect most current colors of appliances and counters and backsplashes, and showing off what could be in that house and the furniture and the paintings. So that preliminary plat map is what the developer shows, and in order to sell one of those lots, that's all they need. The developer only needs to show a preliminary plat map for the purpose of getting under contract. But what do they need that to be in order to close on that sale? They have a contract on the lot, but in order to close on that lot, what kind of plat map does it need to be? Not preliminary, but oh, if only it were in the middle of the page. The final approved plat map. There it is. Thank you, Keisha. The approved plat map, the one that's locked in. There's no more changing it at that point. Preliminary means it may change, and you don't want to close on something that could change. You want your buyer to know exactly what they're getting. There it is. Preliminary plat approval before creating the contract. Final plat approval and recordation before we close on it. And then if a developer sells them a lot that does not have a final approved plat map that's been recorded, they face criminal charges. It is a criminal act to close on lots in an unapproved subdivision. We talked about zoning because this whole section was about land use controls, and our job as brokers is to discover and disclose what those zoning laws and rules are, right? If our client wants to use it as a certain thing, they better be able to. Don't let them buy it without making sure they can use it in the way that they intend. The purpose of zoning laws is to promote the general health, safety, welfare of the public good, right? We're putting things in certain parts of town, the residential section, the commercial section, the industrial section, so as not to have things that harm people or property values, ideally. Most cities have long-range planning. You could probably go to your local city's website and look up in the zoning section, look up the long-range plan and print off the PDF, and it'll show you what they have in mind for the next several years. It's also probably where you could find information on building codes and environmental regulations and subdivision regulations. Speaking of building codes, they are in place so as to keep people safe. When you're building a house, the city inspector comes out and verifies that everything has been built to code at each step in the process. The foundation, the framing, the roof, the sheetrock, the insulation, the electrical, the plumbing, because they want to make sure it's all done right so as not to create a hazard that could make the property fall down or burn down or flood away. And after all those inspections are done, the house is complete, the final inspection is to issue the CO, the Certificate of Occupancy. That's what you need in order for the buyer to be able to close and actually live in the house, close and sleep in the house. Last couple things, something called the Interstate Land Sale Full Disclosure Act. It applies to 25 or more lots that are across state lines, and the developer has to provide full disclosure, property report given to purchasers to make sure that they're not buying swampland, right? To make sure that they're not defrauding somebody who maybe doesn't get to actually see the place before they buy it. They are given a right to rescind so that they have a chance to actually see it and back out if they need to. And violations of this act could be both civil and criminal consequences. Okay, private land use restrictions. We talked about public ones. That was about zoning. The government has police powers to enforce zoning laws. Well, this is different. These are the private land use restrictions. And if the government enforces the public land use laws, restrictions, who enforces the private land use restrictions? How could you? Yeah, the co-owners, your neighbors are going to turn you in. They're going to sue you. They're going to talk to an attorney and say, "Hey, you need to stop doing what you're doing because it's against the covenants and restrictions." If they want to spend the money to do that, right? It probably is going to need to be a pretty big deal. So if you see the term CCRs, that's conditions, covenants, and restrictions, there are protective covenants possibly for a neighborhood that the developer created. They establish these in order to maintain whatever the qualities are that they're trying to maintain in this neighborhood. It could be the style of house, single level only, two-story, could be colors, like a color palette. You can paint your front door, but only if it follows the rules. So it couldn't be like a crazy neon color, perhaps. Landscaping requirements that you have to have some. You can't just cut them down. Storage sheds. Some neighborhoods say, yes, you can have a storage shed, but it needs to be built to the same architectural look of the house. Sometimes that's the case, and you can't bring one home from Home Depot because it's got to be custom built to the look of your house. Not necessarily, not for every neighborhood, but that could be one of the requirements. As brokers, we need to be sure we provide our buyers with these covenants and restrictions. so that they know what they're getting into before they are committed to buying the property. And as a listing agent, you need to find those from your seller. It's probably easier just to get them from your seller, because sometimes it's harder to track these things down, or if it's an HOA neighborhood, you might even have to pay for them, but the seller usually can get them for free. Another big one are fence types and heights of fencing. How tall can the fence be? If you ride through any given neighborhood, go to some neighborhoods that might look really fancy, and I'll bet you'll see very similar styles of fencing, right? The higher the price point, the more similar the fencing probably is going to be, because they keep that locked down pretty tight. It might be that they allow a 6-foot privacy fence. It might be the only kind they allow. They might only allow like a 4-foot metal picket type fence, or the combination of the two. But what they probably will not allow is a chain link fence or something taller than 6 feet or 5 feet. So putting in a fence and then asking permission is pretty expensive, because you might end up having to take up that fence. So the two enforcers of private land use controls, or these protective covenants, would be either the HOA, if there is one, or the residents. Because keep in mind, just because a neighborhood has covenants and restrictions doesn't mean it also has an HOA. They may not have a homeowners association at all, but they could still have a list of rules, covenants, and restrictions that everyone has to follow. So if there is an HOA, that's an easy one. Somebody violates a rule, they're going to tattle on them to the HOA, and somebody with the HOA is going to send them a letter. Say, we found out that we drove by and we saw that your fence is too high, or that your storage building is not conforming to the right look, or you painted your door but it's the wrong color. You'll get a letter first. Some neighborhoods, by the way, when you put your house on the market, they don't let you just put any old yard sign out there. You've got to get a custom-made yard sign. Anybody seen that? You go through a neighborhood, you see the yard signs all look alike. That's because the neighborhood's restrictions require that you go to a certain sign maker and have them all look this certain uniform way. It doesn't matter what your firm logo colors are. You've got to put it in the colors of the neighborhood, and it's probably going to be another $100 on top of what a typical sign might cost, but that's just the cost of doing business. And I had one where it was a neighborhood. We were putting it on the market really fast, and I didn't even think about it. I sold them the house, and a few years later, they wanted to sell it really quick. And so I just tossed a sign in the front yard, and within the day, my seller called and said, somebody from the HOA came by and told us that the yard sign needed to be custom to the neighborhood. And I just thought, oh, I should have known. I should have thought about that. But it really wasn't a neighborhood I would have suspected that from. I just didn't check because I didn't take the time. And they tried to charge him like a $50 fine, which I was, of course, going to pay myself if need be. But they ended up talking their way back out of it. But that's how quick it can be. That was like same day. They told me that, and I said, okay, then pull it up, put it in the yard, and we'll regroup, and I'll get one made real quick. What can happen? What's the worst that can happen if you don't pay your HOA dues? If you cross up with the HOA, that homeowners association has what kind of power if you don't pay? Yeah, a lot of power. Some people have a problem with that. Some people are like, that's too much power. But the HOA could, with enough non-payment, overdue payments or never paid, could foreclose on the property, put a lien on the property and foreclose. And there it is. So our duty with regard to private land use restrictions as brokers is, again, to discover and disclose. Don't misrepresent. It's so easy, especially the more things you're showing them and the more experience you have. You kind of think, well, I know the answer to this. Let me just answer it. Or I think I know what the answer is, and it's probably the same as it was when I sold that other house across town. Beware. Be careful what you say. Don't misrepresent either willfully or negligently. I'll bet a lot of the disciplinary actions have to do with negligent misrepresentation, because people just say something and don't verify it later, and it goes undone, unchecked, and then after closing, then they find out something was wrong, and the new owner has to pay something because the agent didn't give them proper information. And let's make sure we look for potential restrictions, right? As you're going through a neighborhood, you might know that your client wants to put an extra tall privacy fence, like a 6-foot privacy fence, but you notice that no one has such a thing. Red flag. You're going to want to definitely double check on their behalf and find that covenants and restrictions document and look and help them look for it, and then ask, right? Do your due diligence to discover and disclose. Help them understand, can I build what I want to here? It might have to do with the business that they want to operate in the neighborhood. Can they even operate a home business in the neighborhood? That would be another thing that would show up in the covenants and restrictions. Are we good? All that makes sense? Good. I'm looking at faces. Okay, nobody's asleep. All right, good job. Pop quiz. If there is a conflict between public land use restrictions and private ones, which one must you follow?
Is it private?
It kind of goes back to what we've said before about a conflict of anything where there's a stricter.
Oh,
Yeah,
stricter.
still applies here. The stricter one always applies, even in this situation. So if the zoning laws are not as strict as the private land use control covenants and restrictions, it doesn't matter which the one you follow is the stricter one. You got it. That finishes up chapter 5, or section 5, syllabus section 5. Let's go on over to syllabus section 6, which is environmental controls. It's a short and sweet one. I like this one a lot because it's just day to day, it's real world, and the pictures are scary, so it's always fun to look at gross pictures of mold. Here we go. So, learning objectives here. What is our responsibility as brokers? You're seeing a recurring theme, aren't you? We're always looking at what the broker responsibility is. What are some warning signs and remedies of environmental hazards? We as brokers need to be able to look for red flags. We need to be able to see, does this look like it might be asbestos ceiling tiles or asbestos siding? Or what age is this house? Is it old enough that lead-based paint might be under all those coats of paint somewhere? Federal North Carolina environmental laws, and then liability issues for us as real estate brokers. We don't have to be experts. The commission is not holding us to the standard of being a professional expert inspector of these various things. But you do need to know to look for warning signs. You need to look for red flags and possible hazards. One thing we're going to talk about in a moment are underground storage tanks. Underground storage tanks. That's where people used to store the fuel oil that would drive their system for the heating system, the heating furnace. It was an oil furnace, and they could have a tank just showing up above the ground in the backyard, but it's ugly, so they would bury it sometimes. Houses built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, maybe 60s. That underground storage tank, it may be no longer in use, but did it rust through over the years? Did that oil come out and leach into the ground and therefore cause an environmental problem? That's something we need to think about. We need to know, okay, this is a house in an age where it might have had an oil furnace at one point and therefore an underground storage tank, and you need to look for signs of such a thing. We'll see those signs in a minute. As brokers, we're going to see how we are exposed to things, what the actual risk is of these various environmental hazards, and how are they fixed. And the word for fixing these things is remediation. How is it remediated or fixed? The first one is lead-based paint. That's a big one. Lead-based paint stopped being used in 1978. So if the house is built before 1978, then you have to give the warning that it might have lead-based paint somewhere in the house. Now, since 1978, I would say most houses have probably been painted several times. and that is okay. That is one allowable method of dealing with lead-based paint, is to just cover it up. If it's a house that has flaking paint all the way down to the wood, then if it's built before 1978, some of that paint that's curling up next to that wood might be the original paint that could be lead-based. It is not a requirement that the seller get it tested for lead, but sometimes they do. Sometimes they got it tested for lead because they had some repairs done, or maybe they took out a wall to make an extra room, and that contractor that they hired would be required to say, hey, was this house built before 78? Oh, and you want me to do some demolition? Then I'm going to need to test the paint. I'm going to take a chip, send it off, get it tested, see if it's lead-based, because if it is, that contractor is going to have to do stuff like what we see in this picture: wear extra protection, hang plastic up so that the lead-based paint dust that could come up from the work that they're doing as they cut into the walls and stuff doesn't come up into a cloud, because the risk of lead-based paint is breathing it in. We'll get to that part in just a moment. Let's look at the disclosure, the paperwork itself. On the left is what the actual disclosure that we are required to provide looks like. It's called a lead-based paint, lead-based paint hazard disclosure, lead-based paint disclosure addendum. That's what it is, a disclosure addendum. So it's requirement. It's a piece of paper that you have to bring with you on a listing appointment if the house you're listing is built before 78. And what it says, it's in several sections, but there's a section about the seller, and the seller is saying whether or not they've ever had it tested. Many times they've never had it tested. There may have been many sellers, many owners since 1978, and they have no idea. They never had to test it, never did test it, and they're just saying to the whole world and any potential buyers, I don't know. It could be, but I'm not going to test it, and all I can tell you is I have no idea, and that's okay. At least we've told the buyer what they know. So you might be able to kind of read it there. It says the presence of lead-based paint and lead-based hazards are known. Do you have knowledge of them or not? Is this showing up clearly, by the way? Because I can do a screen share if it's not. Let me know if it's showing up clear or blurry.
The white one's not. It's really small and blurry.
Okay. Let me see if I can just, because why not? We've got the ability to do it. Let me just do it this way. See if this will be better. Is that any better? Just did an actual share of Zoom. Okay, no better? It's worse?
Yeah, it's not better.
Okay, not better, but it's not worse either?
No.
Okay, then we'll just leave it. So I can actually, what I'll do is I'll post that disclosure form in your Google Drive so you can see it firsthand. There you go, Greg. So there's a section for the seller to say whether or not they know it's got lead. There's also a section for the buyer to say, yes, I've received copies of everything, and do I want to test for lead-based paint? If I do, I'm going to do that test within the period of time called the due diligence period. We're going to learn more about that in chapters 7 and 8. But I think we covered some of it. That's basically the time that, as a buyer, you want to have any inspections done so that you can walk away if you need to because of what you learned. You didn't like it. Oh, it has lead-based paint for sure? Well, I don't want to buy a house with lead-based paint, therefore not buying it. I'm walking away and getting my earnest money back because I'm walking away within the due diligence period. And so it'll talk about that. Or the buyer, more frequently, the buyer says, you know what, I don't care. It's probably been painted over 1 million times. I'm going to waive my chance to have a risk assessment. I'm not going to even do it because we're going to paint this hideous color that it's painted right now anyway. That's one more layer of protection. And there's even a place for the agent to initial, saying that they have told the seller of their obligations to disclose whether or not they know it has lead-based paint. So it's this disclosure on the left, but also a pamphlet available with the EPA. You could Google this pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead, EPA, and you'll find it. It's a free PDF that explains how lead-based paint works. What is the hazard of it? Um, the hazard of lead-based paint is, for instance, the window sills could chip. The paint could chip, and apparently it's been known that children might chew on a windowsill, or even if you're opening and closing an old window, the paint could be some paint dust that is put into the air from the action of opening and closing the window. Any sort of disturbing the lead-based paint that creates it in dust into the air that can be breathed, that's the problem. That's what the hazard is. And once it's breathed, it could eventually result in sickness, illness in various people. Sellers not required to test, but they do need to tell if they know for sure that there is lead-based paint, and both brokers and homeowners have to disclose whatever it is they know. This is not something that the owner can hide behind. They can't check no representation and not admit to knowing something on this issue. And then here's the part about having a contractor do work. Under the lead-based paint hazard management program of North Carolina, if you get work done by a contractor, and it's a house built before 78, you've got to use an EPA certified contractor who knows how to properly dispose of lead-based paint. The only exemption there is if you do the work yourself. It is your own house and you're doing the work yourself and you're disturbing the lead-based paint yourself. You don't need you're not required to hire a contractor. You're not required to test for lead, although it's not a bad idea. But an owner-occupied house where the owner is doing the work themselves is exempt from using a certified vendor to do the work. Another potential hazard, is asbestos. We have lots of various products that are made by asbestos. And the danger with asbestos, just like lead-based paint, is breathing it in. The word for asbestos is friable. It's friable. That means it can break down into little. Think of anybody ever touched fiberglass insulation, and then you don't really notice it at first, but a couple hours later you get itchy, right? Because it's little tiny slivers of glass, literally, and it gets into your skin. It's sort of like that. You're breathing in, and that asbestos is pricking sort of the inside of your lungs and could lead to cancer, among other things. So it breaks into tiny filaments that can be inhaled, becomes airborne, could be inhaled. It's cancerous, potentially cancerous, and it was banned in 1978. There's not the same issue of houses built before 78 have to be disclosed for asbestos. That's not the same thing. It just so happens that it was banned in 78. There is no asbestos disclosure addendum, only a lead-based paint disclosure addendum, but asbestos is a concern. There's all kinds of products that it's a great product in terms of fire retardation. It inhibits fire spread, and it actually is pretty good product, except for the fact that it could cause cancer. That little downside, right? So if you see a house that looks like the picture on the far left, probably asbestos siding. And if you see maybe an old school, if you ever been through an old school and seen the multicolor, or in this case the same color flooring that kind of looks like this, probably asbestos tile, and they're scraping it up, and those are chips. And that means the friable dust from the asbestos could be breathed in. So someone would need to wear this sort of thing in order to remove it, right? The whole full hazmat mask and stuff. My favorite product from back in the day is the lower left picture. Look at that. Such realistic looking fake snow for the holidays. They literally sold boxes of asbestos in the 60s and 50s to put under the Christmas tree amongst the children's toys because it looked like fake snow. Makes you kind of wonder, what are we going to learn about in another 20 years that we're doing right now? It's kind of scary. That's a top right picture is some pipes that have asbestos insulation. That's another use for it. Could also be ceiling tiles. It looks kind of like white cardboard, with speckles in it. And I forgot which is which, but if the tile, I think it's either 7 inches or 11 inches square, one of them is more likely to be asbestos ceiling tile than others. You know, it's that those old houses that have that, and it gets saggy sometimes, and you can actually push up on it. So that's what it looks like, and that's the danger of it. It could be breathed. How do we get rid of it? Well, with lead-based paint, you can either paint over it or scrape all the paint off. The problem with scraping all the lead-based paint off is you're probably increasing your chances of breathing in the dust. So most people don't do that route. They just cover over it. Same for asbestos. You could either remove it or forget removing it, just cover it up. If it's house siding like this picture, sometimes you'll see an old house that has new vinyl siding. Probably has asbestos under it because the vinyl is probably a pretty quick way to cover it up. As long as you're keeping it from being broken into pieces and therefore creating dust that can be breathed, that's an adequate solution. Asbestos remediation, right? Correction. Professionally, the professionals there are wearing the masks and disposing it properly. And then the third one that we run across a lot, depending on which part of the state you're in, is this gas called radon. Radon gas. Radon gas is created when minerals in the earth decompose, and those minerals let off a radioactive gas that has no color, no taste, no odor. It's actually the second leading cause of lung cancer. Radon gas is. So how does it work? It comes up through the ground, and if you have a basement, it's quite likely it could come up into your basement. And if it's really rainy, then it's more likely that it's not going to be able to come up through the ground because the rain is clogging up the soil. So it's more likely that you're going to have elevated radon levels in your basement in days where it's raining. So what's it look like? What's the fix, or how do you detect it, I should say? On the left, you'll see some things that are available for purchase. You can buy this from Lowe's or Home Depot or online, and it's just a home kit, and you set it out for 48 hours. Then you bag it up and mail it away, and you'll receive the results. The faster method that the home inspectors use is about a $1,000 device like what you see on the left, and they will place it in a space, probably the basement, or if not a basement, if maybe a slab house. They'll put it somewhere that they deem the proper place according to their training. And this little box is taking an air sample every hour that it's sitting there. And so the inspector will come back after 48 hours, plug it into the laptop, and they'll see what is the average level of radon gas for every hour for those whole 48 hours. The average needs to be less than 4 picocuries per liter of air. Don't worry about what that is. 4 little tiny particles per liter of air, basically. And why 4? I don't know. It was determined to be, I've not verified, but I've heard in Canada the magic number is 12. It's considered a material fact here in North Carolina if radon gas average of the 48 hours of the radon gas level is 4 or more picocuries per liter of air. 4 is the magic number. If it's more than 4, it's a material fact that we have to disclose, because it's a more of an elevated chance of lung cancer threat. It needs to be mitigated or remediated by a professional, and let's see what that looks like. On the far left, you can see there's a PVC pipe going down into the lowest point of the house. Where they're in the basement, sorry, let me find that again. And I'm trying to zoom in here. There we go. They literally drill a big hole, like a 4-inch hole, and they have dug out probably 18 inches down. It probably depends on the area as to how big these things need to be. But they've dug out a hole and put in like coarse gravel in that hole or rock. Then they put this PVC pipe down there, and the radon gas gravitates toward that spot because this pipe has a fan attached to it that sucks air up from the earth. And so it's it's being sucked up. In this case, the fan is located here inside, but you can see the picture next to it. And the one that I've seen more frequently is where the fan is on the outside, actually, and it's sucking that radon sucking air up from that hole that was made, and then sending it out. When it gets to the outside of the house, this is what it looks like. The fan is constantly in a vacuum state, pulling that air up, and then finally it must, as you see here, be released above the roof line. Now, that's going to depend on the state as well. I don't know. I know this guy is Mike somebody. I remember seeing him from HGTV shows. He's a Canadian contractor, really good contractor. So this might be Canadian remediation we're seeing. But the ventilation has to be above the roof line so it can't come back into the house, right? Here's what it looks like up close. Inside, I think it's right here. You can't really tell. But right about here is a little gauge, a gauge that shows whether the vacuum action is still happening. Because if the fan malfunctions or turns off and it's not sucking up the air anymore, it's not working. So this shows you, I think I don't have a super zoomed in version, but it's like almost like a thermometer, like red against the white. And if it's in the shape of a U, I think it's showing that it's not working. If it's in the shape of a J, it's the level of liquid in that little gauge, and it's showing that there is a vacuum happening. So you just need to monitor that. And it's quite effective. I sold a house that was 2,500 foot brick ranch, and it had a basement about that same size. And they had radon, and so the seller actually agreed, or the buyer agreed, to only ask for half of how much it would cost to put in this system. So I went out there and watched them put in the system, got to see all that firsthand. And on that particular situation, the total cost was $1,800. So a couple $1,000s for that size house, and they split it between the two of them. So it's a negotiable thing. It's not required to be fixed by the seller, but something negotiable. We'll come back from break. We'll talk about the next one, which has to do with an insulation type of material. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. This is Neil.
Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Speaking with Neil.
Good.
This is Kembe who's calling about the property at 355 Metal Road. Have you considered selling this property before, sir?
I have it on the market right now.
Okay, so firstly, sir, do you have like an asking price in your mind?
Yeah, it's $1 million.
Okay, sir, but are you sure the property was this number?
Excuse me?
But are you sure, sir, the property was this number?
Yes, it is a commercial property zoned industrial. Have you done the research? Or are you looking for, real
Okay,
quick,
sir, so
are you looking for a flip? Like a residential flip?
you said it's a commercial property?
That's right.
Okay, sir, so firstly, I just need to confirm with my acquisition manager and I will call you back.
Okay. Good job. Welcome back. We left off with a material that is used to create to make insulation, foam insulation. Something called urea formaldehyde is used in pressed wood products as well as insulation. It was banned in 1982. It's another respiratory danger, a threat of respiratory problems. There's some insulation there on the far left and there in the middle, and it gets traps gases as it hardens. They spray it in a liquid form and then it hardens. Here's a big one. Mold. Good old mold. Let me fix this real quick so you can read that better. Mold, you might also hear it referred to as fungal growth or some sort of fungal matter, because some people are leery about using the word mold, some of the actual professionals. And it doesn't take much for it to keep growing once it has started. It takes, I believe, about certain moisture content in the air. I think like 18 to 20% moisture in the air for the mold to possibly actually start growing, and then not much different from that for it to keep growing. So one big issue with mold is when it stems from a flood situation, because the insurance company will fix the flood damage but not the resulting mold remediation quite often. They consider it to be unrelated. Here's some horror stories, some terrible pictures of it. I can just feel my lungs closing up from here. The problem with mold is that there's tons and tons of different species, and people might be more sensitive to some than others. Some people may not have any adverse reaction to it, but some people might be deathly ill from the mold. It's easy to multiply, happens fast, and when a property floods, the mold can start within a day or two and then just really grow from there, especially if it's a vacant house that nobody's around to see what's going on. It gives off toxins, allergens. I knew a man who had mold in the walls of his workplace as well as his residence. It was a pastor, and the parsonage as well as the pastor's office were old, and he was just starting to feel lethargic. And they found some water leaks happening around the office he was in. When they opened up the walls, it was black mold. It has nothing to do with the color, really. It's just the species that it was. It ended up, by the time they found it, it had just saturated his body. He had to have multiple blood transfusions because the mold was in his blood, and it just really brought him down. He had to take time off, and it was a year before when they finally figured it out, and he was treated multiple times for him to finally feel back to normal. And part of it is just not understanding what the problem is until it's gotten so far along. So he was obviously very allergic to that particular species of mold. You'll see it in crawl spaces. If you ever crawl up under a house and there's been a leak of some sort, you'll see things that look like this. It can start to grow when there's 60% humidity in the air, and then once the wood content, this is the one I was talking about, the moisture content of the actual wood hits 16%, it can start growing. And then if whatever is causing the moisture to happen just doesn't get fixed and it just stays wet, it just keeps on growing. Mold is an organism that thrives on water and food. The food is the wood, and then the water is the water that's leaking. To detect the moisture content of the wood, the inspector has a device with two metal prongs, and he pokes it in the wood, and that he reads that moisture content. So it could occur in lots of places. It could happen because of plumbing leaks under cabinetry, as we see here in the middle. It could quite often be a basement problem or a crawl space problem. You could have a combination of mold and radon in the same house. Obviously, they're unrelated, but because of the water, the mold could be there, and the radon is just coming up just because it happens to be there. By the way, on the radon, it could show up in one house but not the next door house. And it tends to be, if you look it up on Google, for North Carolina radon cases, the mountains, because there's more rock in the earth to decompose, the mountains tend to have a higher radon level or more frequency, and it gets less gradual across the state. But it still pops up, and we have it around here. But there's no real rhyme or reason to it. Back to mold, though, it could be from a plumbing leak, and it's just behind the walls. A couple ways to control it is to have a vapor barrier. You can see on the left, that's a really good vapor barrier. It even goes up the piers there. Those stacked block supports are called piers. And then on the right, that's an even better vapor barrier. That's what's called an encapsulated crawl space. It's more expensive, but you can see that there's really no dirt exposed at all. It's completely covered, just like the interior of the house. With these encapsulated crawl spaces, they actually have heated and cooled air running through it as well. And it's just probably the best method to make sure that mold is not going to be a problem, because it's not inside. It's out. It's held out by the plastic. But even on the right, just having a layer of plastic called a vapor barrier, and in this area, or at least this state, I think they want a thickness of that plastic like 6 millimeters. That's not a testable item, but just to give you an idea, something you could get at Lowe's. But it usually needs to be put down across all of the crawl space dirt, at least 80 to 90% coverage, things that they'll tell you. The professionals will give you that information as needed. But what it does when it's just a vapor barrier, just plastic on the ground, is it keeps the moisture in the ground from evaporating into the air and rising up and then getting into the wood. That's as little as it could take. It could be a combination of the vapor, the moisture in the air getting in there, plus a leak, perhaps. One of the common requests is a vapor barrier of plastic to keep that from happening. Here's the thing about insurance. You can see this is obviously a flood. There's a Tupperware lid on the ceiling fan, so the flood might be covered, the actual flood damage covered by insurance, but the mold resulting from it could possibly not be covered. So it's good to know what your coverage is. How does it go away? Somebody shows up wearing something like this. You could certainly try to do it yourself, but the hazard is breathing it in, so probably not advisable. They are using this thing on the right, would be what's called a HEPA vacuum, HEPA, a very finely filtered vacuum system to remove the mold. Some people say just put some bleach on it, it'll kill it, but the bleach could actually harm the wood itself. So better than bleach is like a mold or a fungicide, a specific fungicide that they're spraying there on the left. And they just go through, and the average remediation for mold that I've ever heard about, I mean, you're automatically looking at about $5,000 plus. $4,000 or $5,000 plus to go through and remediate this stuff. Obviously, it depends on the coverage. What you need to know for mold, another little tidbit is, what does the Real Estate Commission say about mold being a material fact? Is mold, the presence of mold, a material fact? No. The presence of mold is not a material fact in and of itself. An unusual amount in an unusual location is a material fact. That amount tends to be like about a 1 square foot. How do you measure it? Because mold doesn't grow in perfect geometric shapes. Well, that remains to be seen. But if it's a little bit, it's going to be case by case. If it's just a little bit, you're probably okay. But probably just best practice to disclose whatever you know, right, as a broker. But officially, mold is not a material fact unless it's an amount, a significant amount like that, at least 1 square foot. And when they say an unusual location, I think they just mean where it grows, a place where you can't find it usually if you run across it. Underground storage tanks are next, and that's kind of a little drawing of what it looks like. It is a material fact if a property has an underground storage tank. And we as brokers have to disclose it. We also need to disclose that it might be there. we might not know for sure, but because of the age of the house and we know that it used to have an oil furnace perhaps. You ever gone down the hallway of an old house and there's a grate in the floor and you're worried about dropping something down there, and you look down there and there's certainly pins and things that people have dropped over the years? That was probably an oil furnace, and it may still be, or they may have converted to a heat pump or natural gas. But if it's the right age, or if you see other houses that have it, you might even look up old listings as far back as you can find for that neighborhood and see what the heat type was that they listed on the MLS. But when is it considered an underground storage tank? Even with only 10% of the tank being underground. As little as 10% of the tank being underground constitutes an underground storage tank. So here's how it is. It's buried. There's a pipe that pokes up from the ground that you use to put more oil in the tank. There's also another pipe that's quite often right beside this pipe. In this case, they have it going up the wall of the house, but it could be right beside the fill tank, where what's called the vent pipe. Just like when you pour something out of a pitcher, like a tea pitcher that has a lid on it, you pour it gradually, right? You don't just turn it completely upside down like your kid might do, because it's not going to come out as smoothly. Well, that's the purpose of the vent pipe, to make sure that it exits the tank smoothly and properly. Here's how it looks in the wild. There's both of those tanks side by side, right? They're coming up from the ground. One of them is a vent pipe. The other one is the one you use to fill it up. Here's a middle picture where you can see a vent pipe showing. And then here's the far right picture where you can see that it was partially paved over. Sometimes the pipes aren't showing because the owner knows that there's a problem with oil tanks, and they will dig down a little bit and cut it off under the ground, under the surface, and then fill back up with dirt to try to hide it. So if you notice it's a rainy day and you see like a rainbow sheen on the wet areas, that might be signs that there's an underground storage tank. Or concrete or metal or asphalt that looks like it's in a weird place. Maybe that was where a tank used to be. But mainly it's these pipes sticking up from the ground. Here's how they remove it. Literally digging it up and pulling it up from the ground, and then they would test the soil to see if it has ever leaked, because something old enough could have rusted through the sides, and then the oil could have leaked into the ground, and now we have an EPA problem. Now that soil with oil in it must be removed. It might not have to be pulled out of the ground, though. Another possible solution for handling an underground storage tank is to fill it up with some sort of sand or some other kind of medium like that, so as to keep it from caving in, right? There's multiple solutions, but it could be a really big deal. And you as a broker just want to find out if it's your listing. Did you ever have oil heat? Do you think there's an underground storage tank around somewhere this house? Usually the tank is like you see here, somewhere near the house. So maybe you'll see those pipes sticking up in flower beds because the tank is just right there close by. That's the magic of USTs. This thing called CERCLA stands for Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. That's probably one of the longest acronyms that we've run across. What this can be summed up to is this: whoever they can find that has money is who they're going to make pay for the remediation. When it's some sort of an environmental problem or cleanup is needed, the current owner might not be the one who actually did the violation. It's not their fault. They bought the house completely unaware of what happened, but when the situation is revealed, if the previous owner can't be found, even if they're the one who did it, the current owner is the one who has money and is available to fix it. They have to pay for it. So, created in 1980 by the EPA, strict liability. Current owner is responsible for cleanup. Sure, try to find the one who did the problem, who actually created the issue, but they might not even be alive anymore, or they might not have the money to fix it with. They're going to follow the money. The EPA is going to follow the money and get it fixed, cleaned up by whoever has it, even if it's the current innocent owner. There's a variety of environmental laws At the coast, we talked about the delicate ecosystem when fresh water meets waste or meets salt water, and then any lakes or streams or rivers, same kind of thing. So there's a Coastal Area Management Act dealing specifically with coastal property. There's the Dredging and Filling Act. Remember I told you about the old rich dude that just didn't ask permission. He just was prepared to ask forgiveness, and he just dredged the end of the dock so that he could have his bigger boat parked there. But officially, to dredge or fill in waterways, you have to have a permit because they may not even let you do it because it could harm the ecosystem. Erosion control, sedimentation plans, buffer zones, all of those fall under this category. And then the UST, Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Act, regulates how that cleanup must be performed. Because some folks, some contractors who pull the tank up out of the ground, they might be tempted just to fill that hole back up with dirt and not look and test and see if there's any oil contaminated dirt in there to remove. So this act puts that as a legal responsibility. As brokers, our responsibilities include knowing what these issues are, why are they dangerous, how do they go about remediating them, right? This is not syllabus or textbook, but something else we run into in the business is carbon monoxide poisoning. This could kill people, right? This is another colorless, odorless gas. And anytime you have natural gas sources in the house, like heating system or a water heater or a gas stove, you could have the threat of carbon monoxide levels. And it's just good to have these alarms in the house. If it's an FHA loan that we'll talk about later, they probably are going to require a carbon monoxide detector. It's probably not a bad idea to have it as a closing gift or maybe a gift card and say, hey, notice this one that you want to buy didn't have one of these, but you have a gas log fireplace. Here's a carbon monoxide detector. People could go to sleep and never wake up if CO, carbon monoxide, right? CO2 is what we breathe out, carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is deadly. It's usually a building code that you have a CO detector in all residences. Another way that it could get released in the air is if something in the heating system, in the gas furnace, something called a heat exchanger gets cracked. That could allow carbon monoxide gas to escape. So an older heat furnace or oil furnace, gas furnace, a house with such a thing might be a warning sign for you to think about and warn your people about. Look, any issues with your heating system, the inspector, a good inspector is going to make a note that could be an issue. They're going to specifically look at the heat exchanger in a gas furnace and see if it's cracked, because that would be a major problem. These are always fun. Does anybody ever wonder those pictures you see on Zillow or online? They're always good pictures. Well, they're not always good pictures, but they're always intentional, right? They don't usually, you might drive by the property in person, and when you're driving by, you see something like this. But the pictures that were posted online don't show this. And maybe the photographer just sort of maybe moved a little bit this way to let the chimney hide that power line. Well, these high-tension power lines are known for electromagnetic fields, EMF radiation. It's another one that's not in the syllabus or the textbook, but it's sort of not 100% proven. There's no laws or rules or requirements for disclosure. Some people have done their research and they avoid properties near such things as these, but we don't have any sort of disclosure requirements for such a thing. And then finally, landfills or waste disposal sites. So it's a pretty elaborate system. I've told you that I have a landfill sort of for a neighbor. It's a couple of miles away. I can see it from the end of my road, but I don't think I've ever smelled it. I'm not in one of those neighborhoods that's close enough for that. But they are constantly moving the earth over it. They're covering that stuff with plastic. It's buried in the ground. It's lined, in this case, you can see the diagram here. They line it with clay to prevent any sort of nonsense from leaking and getting into the soil. And then they put topsoil on the top of it. This could eventually fill up, right? And you can only put so much trash in the ground. So oftentimes when you do have a landfill that's all done, what can you do with it? You can't build on it. So maybe it becomes a golf course or a park. So if you see a park nearby and you know better, you might think, I wonder, was that ever a landfill? The issue with landfills is decomposition. And when the trash decomposes in the earth, they've got to have a venting system so the gases released from that decomposing can be released and not turn into like combustion or explode or do anything like that. That's it, guys. That's pretty much environmental. As promised, a quick and easy one. Here we go. We're going to move on into chapter 7. And that is our first big chapter. This is a major deal. Chapter 7 is a big deal in this class, and it's a big deal out in the wild because it's about agency. It is how we represent people. We're of extreme responsibility when it comes to this concept of agency. We need to make sure that the client understands that we're not working for them yet when we first meet them. And what does it involve for us to go to work for them? You know, this business is sort of all about emotion, especially the residential side. It's all about kind of feeling good and people having you could be a brand new agent and be quite successful, more successful than a seasoned agent if you've got the right personality, if you're sort of likable and you know a core group of people that just keep referring business to you. So you can really get ahead of the curve in what you earn in this business just because of your personality and your trustworthiness, right? And knowing some people who are so happy with the kind of person you are and how well you treat them that they tell the world about that and send more business your way. So all of that kind of comes back around to what kind of a job do you do? How good are you at making sure you don't take advantage of them, making sure they understand what their rights are and how you're going to take good care of them. Some level 1 stuff is this concept of implied agency. Remember we talked about express contracts versus implied contracts and how an example of an implied contract is sitting down in the restaurant and eating a bunch of food. They don't ask you for proof of funds. They don't make sure you can pay for it. You can just come in and order the whole thing and eat all of it, $300 worth, and maybe not even be able to pay. That's an implied contract. By sitting down and eating, they assumed you were going to pay. Well, agency, guess what? We cannot have implied agency. We have to be express in our agency and make sure they understand who we are representing and how we can do so. Unfair and deceptive trade practices, lead-based paint, we're going to see what that actually looks like in terms of the document. And then some application. The terms of agency, what is our fiduciary responsibility? Fiduciary is a big word in this class. It means that we have six areas of responsibility that we are required or we are held to with regard to our client. We even have some fiduciary responsibilities for the other person on the other side of the transaction, our customer. If it's our buyer we're helping, the seller they're buying from is our customer. Our buyer is our client, and the seller is our customer. We don't owe the customer as much as we owe our own client. We'll get into more of that. What are these agency relationships, and what is the scope of our authority? There's lots of things we can do with this license. Why do people use us? Well, property management. We've talked about this. We're going to see, by the way, in these next two chapters, 7 and 8, we're going to see a lot of crossover with the license law and commission rules. So just be buckled up and ready for that. Obviously, we can lower left of the picture here. Oh, sorry, guys. I'm sorry. Yeah, you just interrupt me if you don't see slides. There we go. All right, all you missed was the words here that I was reading off. So here's our first pictures. Yeah, definitely interrupt me if you're not seeing slides. I'm trying really hard to look into the camera so much that I forget to look at your faces and the chat sometimes. Why do they use us? Property management, maybe. Auctioning, need a broker license for auctions. To help with negotiations, to help them provide paperwork and complete contracts and make offers and work through the counteroffer process. Also to list properties for sale and to list properties for rent. So all sorts of things is why they are using us. Some people are worried that the technology is going to run us out of the business. But I think as long as relationships have value, we don't have any worry of where we're going. Yes, you can certainly buy a house sight unseen and online only. That's a possibility now. But most people aren't comfortable doing that, right? Having an advocate, a real person advocate on your side still has a lot of value. And those types of brokerages that use more of that sort of thing, and they're sort of threatening the traditional way of this business, they tend to not make up more than 5% or so of the market, and they come and go. So still not going anywhere. Okay. When you see a for sale sign in the yard, and an agent might have their picture on it, and it certainly has their phone number and their name on it, who is that agent representing? This is an easy softball question, right?
The seller.
The seller. That seller hired that agent. So if you're interested in that house and you call the phone number on that sign because you want more information, that agent might answer the phone, right? And they might say, hey, do you have your own agent? Is that something you've run into? Does that sound like a rational possible next order of events there? They're asking if you have somebody looking out for your own best interest, your own real estate agent, because you might. In a market like this, where there's so many of them in the business, a lot of people know a lot of agents, but some people don't have an agent that they're working with yet. They got excited about how that house looks, and they went ahead and called on the sign for more information. So it's not unusual as a listing agent to get a phone call from somebody that does not yet have their own agent. And so when they call you and you're the listing agent, that means you're representing the seller. If you see the term listing agent, that means the person that you are responsible for is the seller. No surprise there. I did not blow your mind with that piece of information. But let me go through a couple of things here, some terminology. The buyer and the seller side, we've got the buyer side and the seller side. They have potential representatives, right? The seller is represented by a broker if they have a broker, because they could certainly sell the house by themselves. But if they list it, that person's going to be known as a listing broker. And I could hear it in your minds. I could hear you all say, duh, we know this. That is not new information. You might have heard that person also referred to as a seller's agent. ERS, sellers, the agent of the seller, like a possessive. The agent that belongs to the seller, looking out for the seller. What do we call the agent helping the buyer? There are several possible names. Certainly we could call them the buyer's agent. But here's the one that's confusing, that you will most definitely run into on the test at some point. If you see the word selling agent or broker, ing, selling, ing, ends in ing. Selling agent always means the one helping the buyer. Write it in your notes. The selling agent helps the buyer. Now, we're going to learn what it is. There's a couple of different ways you could help a buyer. In one of those ways, you're looking out for all of their interests. When you're a buyer's agent, that means you are explicitly hired by the buyer to look out for them 100%. That's what a buyer's agent does. But there's a possibility where you could be helping the buyer, but you're not actually a buyer's agent. You're this other thing that can be confusing, so hang in there. If you're not a buyer's agent, meaning you don't have an official hiring employment document called a buyer agency agreement, if you don't have that between you and your buyer, then you are what's called a sub-agent to the seller. So, we'll talk about what that actually means in a little while. Don't worry about it just yet. So it's either this or this. And so if you see the word selling agent, what you don't know is, are we talking about a buyer's agent or are we talking about a sub-agent to the seller? All we know from the term selling agent is that it's the agent helping the buyer. They might be helping them as a buyer's agent, or they could be helping them not as a buyer's agent because they don't have that buyer agency agreement signed. Sometimes people refuse to sign the buyer agency agreement because they don't want to, or they're worried or something. But that doesn't mean the agent doesn't get to help them. The agent could still help them. They just need to make sure that buyer understands, look, don't tell me things you don't want the seller to know, because if you refuse to sign this buyer agency agreement, and so that's off the table, then what I become is this thing. And if I'm a sub-agent to seller, that means my obligations are to the seller. I can help you make your offer, fill out the forms, provide the forms, but don't tell me stuff you don't want the seller to know because you didn't hire me to be your agent. But I can still help you. But my loyalty is to them, not you. So it's a weird, precarious kind of a situation. This whole representation thing in real estate is confusing. This is also the reason people miss questions and struggle with this particular topic, because it's different from most every other industry that you ever run into, right? If you go to the car lot and within about 2 minutes, one of those people are going to approach you as you're looking through those cars, who do they represent? There's no doubt who they represent, right? You know who they're working for. They might be really nice. They might not even be they might not be annoying. Some of them are really good at building rapport really fast. What if one of those car lot salesmen called you the next day and you roll your eyes and you're like, oh, brother, what are they going to run by me this time? And they say, hey, I don't mean to bother you, but, we had a great conversation yesterday. Just letting you know, we don't have anything for you here on this lot. I still can't find anything that fits what you're looking for. But when I got home, I spent about 3 hours looking around on the internet, and I found another car at a different car lot that I think would be perfect for you. That might surprise you, right? Wait a minute. Who's paying you? Why did you go through all of that work to connect me with a different car that's not even your car lot that you work for? That's not something that happens in real life, but that's something that happens in real estate all the time. So we're going to talk more about how that goes down. Let's start with the beginning up to the 1950s. Let me get over to my slides here. Up to the 1950s, and including the 1950s, there was no such thing as a buyer agent. It was not a legal entity. It was not a way to represent anybody. In other words, buyers did not have a representative. They did not have an agent at all. There was none of it. The only way any agent ever helped anybody in real estate up and including the 50s was helping sellers sell the house. So if you were a buyer wanting to buy something in the 50s, you would have to literally go to each real estate firm in the town. There might be 3 of them. There was no MLS. There was no multiple listing service book. There was no central database. You would have to go to each office and say, hey, I'm looking for this kind of house. What do you got? And they might say, I don't have anything like that. And then you would leave and go to the next one. Inefficient, right? And buyer beware, because that agent was only hired by those sellers that they have the listings of. There was nobody designed to protect the buyer at all. So a seller would hire an agent to sell their house. And if a buyer wanted to see that house that was for sale, if they did see one that they liked, that agent that they went into the office and the agent said, yeah, I got a couple that I think you might like. I can show them to you. But that buyer better have kept their mouth shut, because anything they said to that agent, the agent would be legally required to tell the seller, right? And they may or may not have done a good job explaining that to the buyer, because buyer agency wasn't even a concept. The agent always represented the seller. There was no buyer representation. As we get through this course, this will make more of an impact in your minds, because, wow, there's nothing helping the buyer back then at all. So if you wanted to go buy a house, you'd just have to go office to office. Well, in the 60s, there was a development that happened, because somewhere in the 50s, I'll bet a buyer went into one of those offices, and let's just say they talked to Frank. Frank was in the office. It was his firm, and they said, "Hey, Frank, thanks, nice to meet you. Do you have any listings like this? Single level, a wood siding on 3 acres in this part of town," or whatever. And Frank would say, "Yeah, I've got one of those." Or Frank might say, "No, sorry, I don't have any." Now, what Frank might think to himself in that moment, wait a minute, I don't have a listing like that, but I was on the phone with my competitor down the street, George, and George just told me that he had a new listing like that. I bet this buyer would like that listing. And maybe Frank had an idea in that moment that had never been done before. So when that buyer, he might have said to that buyer, "Hey, you know what? I might have something for you. Let me come on back maybe in an hour and I'll let you know." And so as soon as that buyer left, Frank calls George and says, "Hey, George, I saw that you got a new listing. Well, I've got a buyer that I think might be perfect for that new listing of yours." And George would say, "Oh, great, send them my way. I'll take good care of them." And there's no money in it for Frank. But maybe on this day, Frank thinks, "You know what? Why isn't there any money in it for me?" Maybe Frank decides to be a little bit greedy and says, "Hey, George, I'll send them to you, but would you pay me a fee if I give you this person's information, if I point them your way?" And maybe George is worried that otherwise, if Frank doesn't share the information or send him his way, that he may never run across this person. And so they do. He says, "Yeah, you know what? Never done this before, but sure, I'll pay you. Let's just call it, I don't know what, maybe a referral fee." Are you with me? See where I'm going with this? And so that's the first time an agent paid another agent for a lead. Nobody's representing anyone except George is representing his own seller, right? So the buyer comes back, talks to Frank. Frank says, "Okay, I know for a fact there's a listing that sounds like what you might want. Go on over and see this guy George over at this place. He will take care of you." And so it works, and he buys it, and George pays Frank the referral fee. Maybe they do that a few times, and maybe to the point where they start, agents in the town start calling each other and keeping track not only of their own listings, but of the other listings that the other people in town who are in the business also have. Sort of like a conversational MLS, an informal, "Hey, what you got? Here's what I have. Let's see what we can do," but nothing like official or in writing or anything. Maybe one day Frank calls George in the same situation, says, "Hey, I got another buyer for you." And George says, "Frank, I appreciate that, but I'm just so busy. I don't have time for this buyer. I've got other things. But I tell you what, how about I give you a little more money this time, and instead of me showing my listing to your buyer, you bring that buyer and you go show my listing for me. I'll pay you a higher referral fee. You stick with that buyer the whole way through. Instead of handing them off to me for just a quick referral fee, you do it because I'm busy." And then Frank shows George's listing to that buyer, makes an offer, because before George handled all of that stuff, but now Frank's doing it. Sort of the infancy of maybe a buyer agency kind of thing. But keep in mind, there was still no such thing as legal buyer agency. Frank could act like one, but he wasn't obligated to the buyer. He didn't have any sort of loyalty requirement to that buyer. And so I'm sure many agents started doing this. They started sharing, "Oh, well, yeah, I'll pay you. If you come and do all the work, I'll still split the commission with you in some fashion, not necessarily 50-50, but maybe." And so that's a thing. And over time, they probably started thinking, well, why do we keep getting on the phone all this time? I'm tired of making phone calls every day asking all of my competitors if they have new listings. How about instead of doing that, we put it in a one single resource? You with me? And thus the MLS was born. But we still don't have buyer agency yet. So when the 60s rolled around, you started to see this thing called agency cooperation, where two agents, two different firms would have a transaction together, one helping the buyer, one helping the seller. But legally, there was still no requirement that the one helping the buyer actually had the buyer's best interest in mind. Now, you and I both know that in order to grow any business and sell anything, you want the customer to feel like you took care of them. So I'm pretty sure they were violating agency laws left and right, because they should have always been erring on the side of taking care of the seller. But you better believe that they made friends with those buyer clients. Even though they were helping the buyer, holding their hand all the way through, they were probably acting like buyer's agents while they didn't really have the legal requirement to do so, just in the interest of having repeat business, so the buyer would know that they took care of them. But there was nothing legal about it. They still, all agents officially should have taken care of sellers all of this time. There was only something called seller's agency, no buyer's agency at all. But it was happening left and right? Just in the interest of liking somebody and taking care of them. I'm going to take care of my buyer person more than that seller that I don't even know. Just because my buyer wants to buy their house, I'm still going to be loyal to my person, but that turned out to actually be the wrong loyalty. All agents should have been loyal to the sellers. So this is when the agent cooperation started happening. Anybody ever seen an old MLS book? It literally was about the size of your textbook or bigger. It was like this big monster catalog that would come out every month. And since people kept listing properties in between the publication of the big catalog, they would put out supplementals of additional listings throughout. It was a huge killing of massive quantities of trees, lots of things. And when you opened up these MLS books, you'd see that little image on the right, and that's all you got. That was the one picture you got to see. That was the little bit of information that you could see about the property. Let me try to zoom in on those words. Maybe you can read them, but this is when you started seeing weird abbreviations, and you kind of need a little bit of training to figure out what some of these words mean. And I don't even know what some of them still mean, but you've got like basic bedrooms and bathrooms, and I don't even know what SFC means. Age is obvious. That's a pretty fancy house for back then. 300, is that a number? All kinds of unusual words and abbreviations here. And just not many pictures, right? Pretty typical to only have the one picture. So the problem here was who's representing who. Buyers probably thought the agent helping them was representing them and keeping their secrets, but that agent didn't have any legal obligation to keep their secrets. If the agent helping the buyer had chosen to go tell the agent helping the seller, or maybe the seller themselves, that the buyer would actually pay more than what they offered, there's nothing legally that buyer could have done to them. They could not have sued them and won because there was no legal obligation. And that sounds underhanded. It's like, well, yeah, but why would they? I'm just saying they could have, because there was no laws against it. Now, fast forward to not that long ago. I mean, I guess it's relative to your age. To me, the 90s is like, yeah, it was several dozen years ago, but in terms of like agency laws, that's pretty recent. In fact, I got in the business in 1996, 1 year after buyer's agency became a thing. How did it start? Well, eventually a buyer put two and two together and realized, wait a minute, my broker is not actually representing me. They told me they were, but there's no legal buyer representation even possible. And so they got mad and they sued Adena Realty. And Adena ended up settling 3 similar lawsuits for like $19 million. And the result of all of that changed the industry across the country and welcomed buyer agency as an option. But again, up until the mid-1990s, there was no buyer agency. An agent showed multiple homes, worked for the buyer. The buyer assumed they were representing the buyer's best interest, but they weren't. It was not legally a possibility. So now you've got this buyer agency coming into the market in 1995. Well, if you could have an agent helping a buyer and an agent helping a seller, that means you could have one agent helping a buyer and a seller in between the two of them. What if you have a listing and somebody calls your yard sign, calls your number off the sign, and they say, I don't have my own agent. And you say, okay, great, I can help you. I'll be what's called a dual agent. Because buyer agency became a thing, by necessity, dual agency had to be created because it allowed for this possibility. This concept where an agent could represent both parties, and you need to make sure you understand what is your responsibility to both of those parties. So as a dual agent, we'll see in a lot of times, you'll get sick of this throughout this course, but here's the first little glimpse of dual agency. If I'm a dual agent between a buyer and a seller, then I cannot be loyal to both of them, to either of them. In fact, if the buyer says to me, hey, what should I offer on that house, your listing that I called you on? I would say, well, here's the comparable sales. Here's a couple of things that have sold nearby in the last month or so. But I can't give you advice on what you should offer. And that buyer might say, well, why are you getting paid? Why can't you? I can't because I'm a dual agent. I can't give loyalty. I can't give an advantage to one party over the other. For me to tell you what you should offer would be me working against the seller in favor of you. But in the same way, I can't go over to the seller and say, okay, seller, here's the offer from this buyer. Take a look. I can do that. But if the seller says, oh, they're offering this, I'm asking $300, they're offering $280. What do you think I should do, Neil? I would have to say, I can't give you that advice. Because remember, you gave me permission to be a dual agent, and I can't give an advantage to you or them either way. I have to be more of a mediator in between you both. Can't give either one of you an advantage over the other. Now, someone might hear that and not like it. Someone might start saying, well, why are you making money at all if you can't look out for me? In fact, you met me first. I'm the seller. I hired you, and then that buyer came along. Why can't you give me preferential treatment? I would say, because it's dual agency, right? You gave me permission to be one. I can't be one unless you give me permission to be one in writing, so I had to get that from you. And the same for the buyer. I can't be a dual agent for the buyer without their permission in writing. And so it's weird. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure you've seen it done wrong. But that's the gist of it. And that's why the Real Estate Commission has job security, because agents will continue to do this stuff wrong altogether. I'm talking about a comment that just popped up. Someone said they had a dual agent tell her exactly what to offer. And that doesn't surprise me at all. Sadly, we get it wrong all the time. So now we've got buyer agency and seller's agency, and that creates dual agency. So recap, in the 50s, had one-person offices. They were only helping sellers. They were having listings. If you wanted to see houses, you had to go to each office. There was no MLS. In the 60s, they started cooperating between agents, but there was still no buyer agency and therefore no dual agency. And then in the mid-90s, there was the lawsuit in the early 90s, which resulted in the creation of buyer agency in the mid-90s. So we come back from break, we'll talk about this concept of first substantial contact. This is some dense material. So, yeah, that looks like it was sketchy. You bet. Yep, that's exactly what we're trying to avoid. What Carrie wrote there in the chat is exactly what not to do. Right? That'll lose you a license real quick. I'll see you guys in 10. Welcome. Yeah, okay. There we go. Welcome back. Good to see you. Real quick, who does the selling agent represent, the buyer or seller? Who are they helping? Which side is the selling agent helping, the buyer side or the seller's side? In the chat if you want, or out loud. Yeah, the buyer side. Good job. I have no way to remember this for you. There's logic for both sides, right? It makes sense to think of it either way. So you're just going to have to memorize it. So just maybe think the seller's side would be the seller's agent, but probably more likely the listing agent. And so the other sell word is for the buyer. The selling agent is the one helping the buyer. What we don't know, though, by the word selling agent, again, what we don't know is it a buyer's agent or is it a sub-agent to seller? If they don't have a buyer-agent contract or agreement signed between them, then by default, they are a sub-agent to seller. We'll learn about what that means in a little bit, really soon here. Let's see where we are. Okay, so in 1995, we got buyer agency. The North Carolina Real Estate Commission got on board and said, let's do buyer agency here. So think about this. I was brand new in 1996. I didn't know any better. I learned this way with buyer agency and dual agency right out of the gates. So I got in the business, and there was a whole lot of old timers who were a little bit frustrated by this new thing called buyer agency and dual agency. Up until that point, they didn't have to go into much detail about this concept of agency. There was only one choice. There was only seller's agency. So I didn't even really know what I was getting into. I just knew that I just learned it in a class, just like what you're learning now. So I knew no better. But there was a whole bunch of aged veteran, older, been in the business. Even if they'd only been in the business a couple of years, they had learned it a whole different way. So this was all brand new. And so the Real Estate Commission put a great emphasis on making sure that we brokers explain to people how all this stuff works. Oh, there we go. And it brings up this point in time called the first substantial contact. When you see the phrase first substantial contact, that is not first initial contact, right? Substantial means you're talking about a very specific couple of things. First substantial contact means the person is talking about one or two M words, money or motivation. So if that potential client talks to you in an open house, right? Anybody gone into an open house before? And you ate their cookies, you ate their lemonade, and they let you walk through. They might have walked along with you. They might have been the agent who actually was the listing agent, or they might have been a newer agent who was sort of handling the open house on behalf of the listing agent. What you may have not thought about at the time, but now you might be thinking is, oh yeah, okay, so that person that I saw in there was the seller's agent, right? They weren't looking out for me yet. Did they try? Did they tell you they could help you find something? Maybe they said they could be your buyer's agent. That wouldn't be a bad idea for them to maybe try to sign you up as a client. If you walked into that open house and you started talking to that agent in there about the Panthers and the Hornets and maybe both your kids happen to be the same age and they play a sport and whatever, you could stand there and chat for like 2 hours with them and still not reach this point in time called first substantial contact, because all you've done is talk about anything else besides money or motivation. Money or motivation. You didn't talk about your financial ability to buy the house. Money. Are you going to pay cash, or are you going to get a loan? Have you talked to a lender? Are you pre-qualified for $400,000? None of that came up. It was all sports talk or kids talk. Or motivation. That didn't come up either. I really need to buy a house by November. I have to be out by February. Must to, have to, got to. That's motivation. The client, the minute you as a broker are talking to a prospective client and they start talking about their money ability or their motivation, you have to stop the conversation and say to them, okay, you know what? Before you say anything that could be harmful to you, I've got to explain how this stuff works, this agency stuff. I've enjoyed talking to you about everything else in the world, but now you've mentioned your financing or your motivation, and so the real estate commission requires that when those topics come up, I must explain to you that I am not working for you yet. I would love to. I think we'd get along great, and I would take great care of you. I could help you buy a house. It may not be this house. By the way, rarely do they buy the house that you're sitting in as an open house. Pretty low chance that buyer is going to actually buy that house. So what you're really trying to do at an open house is sign up new clients regardless of getting that house sold, right? It might be a nosy neighbor who comes into that open house. That's okay. Maybe they're thinking of selling. There's a weird little thing that happens when one for sale sign pops up on a street. It's like mushrooms growing in the yard. Another one or two is going to pop up pretty quick after one does, because it seems like everybody's always kind of thinking about maybe selling at any given moment. So why not talk to those neighbors? But if that neighbor mentions their money or motivation, how much they need to sell for, that would be a big red flag. Wait, before you tell me that, I would love to help you with that, and I hope I can do that and earn your business. However, until the time at which you have hired me, don't tell me anything you don't want a potential buyer to know. On the chance that if you don't hire me to sell your house, but you've told me the minimum you will take, right? And maybe I end up finding a buyer for your house when you do go on the market, then I would be obligated to tell that buyer what I know about you, right? It's a big deal. That's what we're talking about with first substantial contact. Now, if they come into the open house and they say, "Hi, my name is George," that is just first initial contact. You don't owe them any sort of explanation yet. They haven't told you anything about their money or their motivation, right? So we as brokers have a requirement of licensees to provide what's called agency disclosures and tell them, here's how this works, and here are your options. So there are lots of ways a firm and a broker could choose to represent people. They could choose to only help buyers. That's it. They don't even want to work with sellers. I think that'd be a pretty dumb decision to make, but that could be. It's allowable. So whatever it is that your policies are about who you are willing to represent in terms of buyers versus sellers, a broker in charge should have it as a written policy in their policy and procedures manual. It might be that they may say we don't want to do dual agency ever, because remember, it's kind of weird and you don't get to be loyal to both parties. You can't give either one of them an advantage. And some consumers are like, that's stupid. Why would anybody do that? I don't want to have anything to do with it. When I'm teaching continuing education classes, almost every time I'll ask them, just for my own information, how many of you, either because you don't want to or because your firm or broker in charge won't let you, refuse to do dual agency? And I get a lot of hands raised. There's a lot of firms, a lot of brokers that are like, you know what? Let's not even go there. It's weird. We want to only represent one or the other, but not both at the same time. And that's okay. The commission will allow it. It's a firm decision. It's also your own decision as a broker, kind of the combination of the two. If you do decide that you're willing to be a dual agent, now you also need the permission of the parties, the buyer and the seller both. But first it starts with, will the firm let you, and do you want to, right? If you don't want to, you don't have to offer it. It's not required that you offer it. So there should be a written policy talking about the types of agency that the firm will allow. And if you don't like what the firm's policy says, then there's lots of other firms, right, to go to. Also, the co-brokerage relationships, how's that working? And the splits of commission, how much the firm might require you to, they might say, we don't want you to negotiate downward. We as a firm charge 6% commission, and that is what we charge. We're a full service brokerage, and that is the minimum we charge. Don't even try to give anybody a deal. It's at least 6 or it's at least 5. Your firm could make that a rule that you have to follow. They could also say, we want to at least charge 5, but if you want a discount for various reasons, we'll let you. Or if you do want to go lower than this amount, then you've got to take it all off of your side of the commission. We're going to want our commission split to be based on a 6 instead of a 5, whatever. The rules they should be spelled out in a written policy. Also, how much are you sharing with the firm? Or I should say, how much is the firm sharing with you? Because it's actually the firm that gets the money, and then they give you your split from it. And that's wide open. I mean, different firms have different splits. And as a new agent, you'll run into some firms that say, well, you're brand new. I've got to put more time into you to train you. Therefore, I'm going to give you a lower split than if you were non-provisional. So a provisional broker might have a lower split, and it might start 50-50. If you make a commission, then the firm takes half, maybe. Or you could easily find another firm that just gives you like an 80%, 20% split where they take 20% of whatever it is and then give you the remaining 80. It could be a combination of starts at 50 and you work your way up to 70-30, right? Or if it's like a team concept, maybe you join a team where it's some big shot that runs a bunch of ads and they have a lot of leads coming in, and you're basically a hired gun buyer agent working for them. They hand you a lead, a buyer lead, and you call that buyer, make the relationship, explain all this stuff, and go show them houses and get them into a contract, and then you're done. You hand that under contract paperwork over to a transaction coordinator that's hired by the team, and you get the next buyer lead and you go do it all again. You're very specific. That's all you do. And that's what the teams often will hire from when it's a provisional broker, is just a buyer's agent. The split to be such a thing is going to probably be pretty low, because now you don't have to do or pay for any lead generation. You're just handed leads, and that has a lot of value to it. So your split, I've heard of some buyer agents on teams making a 41% split. You're getting 40% of the commission. But hey, if you don't ever have to worry about finding business, they just hand it to you. That's the price of doing business, maybe. It's all negotiable, but it needs to be spelled out. So, what is this word called agent? What is an agent? For our purposes in this class, don't think of a human. An agent, first and foremost, is the firm. The agency agreement, the buyer agency agreement, or the listing agreement, that's not between you and the seller. It's between your firm and the seller, or your firm and the buyer, right? It's the top of the page of the agreement. It says, this is between, fill in the blank, this client and the firm. It is not your name. It is not Joe Blow. It is ABC Realty. Now, you sign the agreement on behalf of the firm. You flip to the last page, only you will sign that listing agreement or that buyer agency agreement. Your broker in charge doesn't even sign it. You have what's called general agency level of responsibility between you and your firm. You have the right and the responsibility to sign agency agreements on behalf of your firm. So when you list a house, you sign that listing agreement on behalf of your firm, but it's your firm who owns the listing. That's something to write down. Testable. The firm owns the listing. So let's say you're a big hot shot. You get in the business. You list 20 houses right out of the gates. You sell a couple of them, and you've got, like, let's say 15 listings. And then you decide the grass is greener and you want to move to a different firm. What do you do? If you think that you're going to get on the phone and call all of those sellers and tell them you're leaving tomorrow, come on along, you just broke the law. You cannot contact the sellers because they're not your listings. They're the firm's listings. You can't say a word to your sellers about leaving. You got to wait for the broker in charge to call them. And if the firm is willing to let you take those listings with you, then they will bring it up to the seller and say, did you want to go with her or do you want to stay with us? But they have every right, that firm has every right to not even make that a possibility. They could talk to that seller and they could say, I'm so sorry to report that she is no longer with us. No, she's not dead. She's just leaving us. Same thing, because she's crazy for leaving. They probably wouldn't say that. But they'll tell them that you're leaving, and then they might say, but good news, we have reassigned your file to another amazing agent with our firm. Now that seller might say, well, wait a minute. That's somebody that I know from 20 years ago from school, and I only hired your firm because I wanted to work with her, which, by the way, is the most common situation because somebody usually is hiring the agent more than the firm that agent works for, right? They're more, the agent is the one that they connected with. Sometimes, like if it's a cold lead, they will hire the firm because of its reputation, but it's usually that relationship that has won the business. And so that seller might find out that you've left the company and they might say, well, I want to go with her. And the broker in charge could say, I'm sorry, that's not a possibility. Well, I fire you. Sorry. Here's the next thing. Agency agreements are not unilateral. You cannot fire them and they cannot fire you. You would have to let each other mutually out of the agreement. So a firm could say to them, I'm sorry, you signed a listing agreement for 4 months and it's only been 2 months. We still have an agreement with you for 2 more months. Well, I just won't let it be shown. I mean, you can't really control that. They could certainly be so angry about it that they decide to make it almost impossible to sell, but they can't get out of the contract. They can't get out of the listing agreement or a buyer agency agreement unless the firm allows them to. That's big, right? Some people like to brag that they fired somebody. They fired their agent. No, you didn't. You only fired them if the firm allowed you out of it, but you had to wait and see if that firm was going to let you out. Sure, you could sabotage it. A disgruntled seller or buyer could say, I'm mad that they won't let me out, so I'm just going to put my plans on hold and just not sell yet. Sure, you could do that. And then they're going to have to let the time expire. Because another thing is all agency agreements must have an expiration date. That's another thing to remember for test taking purposes. There has to be an expiration. You can't have a lifelong, forever and ever term for an agency agreement. They all have to die. They have to have an expiration date. So, worst case though, firm won't let that seller out. The seller's mad. It's going to be 3 more months, and they just have to sit tight. They could refuse showings. They could get offers and turn down all the offers, and they're just waiting for the time to tick by and that listing to expire, and then they can go over to wherever their friend landed and list with them if they wanted to. Or if it's a good enough offer, they might forget their friend and go ahead and take care of business, right? So that's kind of how it all works. But this slide is all about the term agent. From here forward for this class, when you see the word agent, don't think human, think firm. An agent is the firm. So there's more terms about this concept called agency. Some of these mean the same thing. So don't think these are 2, 4, 6, 7 words that are all different. Here's how they work. The word agency is that relationship between the firm and the consumer, right? The consumer could be either a client or a customer, right? We'll talk about that difference at the bottom of the slide. The agent, as you now know, is the firm. You see the word agent, think, oh, that's the firm, that's the company. Sub-agency, this thing called sub-agency, you see that in a couple of different spots in this business. One of them, it's the idea of there being an agent and then an agent for that agent, right? So the firm is the agent, and the brokers within the firm are agents that work for that agent. They're the agents of the agent. They're the sub-agents. So a broker is a sub-agent to the firm they work for. You with me? A broker is a sub-agent for that firm. And then also, remember all the way up to the 1990s, there was only seller's agency, right? Well, until you have become a buyer's agent, then by default, all agents are sub-agents to all sellers. All of us are sub-agents to the seller until we're not. And when do we become not? When a buyer has hired us to be that buyer's buyer agent and we sell a house to them, then we are not a sub-agent to the seller of the house that buyer bought because we're the buyer's agent for that buyer. We're still a sub-agent to the other sellers out there in the market. So sub-agency is one of two things. Either this seller's sub-agency, this number two thing, where I'm an agent and I'm a sub-agent to all those other sellers, even for other firms. Because if my buyer refuses to sign the hiring document called a buyer agency agreement, they just say, you know what, I know you've shown me houses, but I've not signed anything yet, and I'm not going to sign it. But I want to make an offer. If they refuse to sign that buyer agency agreement, then by default, you are a sub-agent to the seller. You can still help them write the offer, but your role is going to be as a sub-agent to the seller. They better not tell you anything they don't want the seller to know. You would be a selling agent because you're helping the buyer. Selling agent acting as a sub-agent to the seller. I'll pause for your brain to explode because it's like, what? These words, just stop it. It's too late at night. I know. I'm sorry. Hang in there. It will get more comfortable, more familiar as we go. So when you see a weird phrase like on a test question, the selling agent acting as sub-agent to seller did such and such. Okay, wait. Selling agent, that means they're helping the buyer. And then which of the two possible ways are they helping the buyer? Are they a buyer agent? No, they're not. That would require them to have signed a buyer agency agreement. If there is no buyer agency agreement, then by default, they are a sub-agent to the seller, just like they would have been in the 1950s or 60s or 70s. You with me? It's a weird concept. Hang in there. Okay, sub-agent in white there. Broker in the firm could be a sub-agent to that firm. We talked about that. Or broker in general, any broker would be a sub-agent to a seller unless they're helping the buyer for that house. The words principal and client are the same person, the same thing. That's your client. That's the one to whom you owe the fiduciary responsibilities. So when you see the word principal and client, interchangeable. Now, if you're helping the buyer, that is your client, if you're a buyer agent for them. The seller that they're buying from would be your customer, the one on the other side of the fence from you, right? The party against your party, the party that's against your client. So if you're a listing agent, you're helping the seller. The buyer who comes along is your customer, and your seller is your client. And the seller is your principal, and the buyer is that other agent's principal, right? Okay. So the responsibilities we talked about, this thing called fiduciary. A fiduciary relationship, think about how an attorney represents someone, right? You can write that attorney-client privilege. You can tell attorneys things and they can't be used against you. So there's that higher level of relationship, a fiduciary. You don't have quite that level, right? If they tell you they robbed a convenience store, that's not covered under the real estate laws, but you do have some fiduciary duties for your client. That fiduciary relationship is when a firm is authorized to act on behalf of that principal. And then you are a subagent to your firm, so you are authorized to act on behalf of that principal as well. So this is the thing that makes real estate so weird compared to every other industry. This idea of agency. Who's representing who? By the way, you could be a buyer agent and your loyalty and all of your fiduciary relationship you owe to your buyer client. But who's paying your money? Who's paying you? The seller's paying the commission to their agent firm, and that firm is splitting it with your firm, and then your firm is splitting it with you. So your loyalties are to your buyer, but the compensation is coming from the seller across the fence, who is your customer, to whom you don't owe as much stuff as you do to your buyer client, right? So where the money comes from doesn't really dictate where your responsibilities lie, if that makes sense. All right, when we see this word agent, why are we called real estate agents? Because we represent clients, not because we're selling real property, but because we're representing people, right? So frequently, you're seeing the word agent and you're thinking a person, but just remember in this class, you see agent, the firm is who the agent is. And then the broker within that firm is the sub-agent representing the firm and the clients that the firm has. Even if you're the one who brought them in, right? The firm never would have gotten that buyer if it weren't for the fact that you knew them from your exercise class or from the gym, right? Sub-agent, when a licensee is a sub-agent to the firm is representing the client as an agent to them, and the licensee is representing the firm and is a sub-agent to that principal or that client. With me? Here's the principal. That's the one who hires the firm to act on their behalf. And a principal or client could be lots of different things. It could be a buyer. Please help me buy something. It could be a seller. Help me sell my house. It could be a landlord. Help manage my rental property for me. Or the tenant. Help me find something to rent. As a new agent, you might end up working with some renters who want you to help them find something to rent, because it's kind of tough out there. You're not going to make a lot of money helping tenants. It's not like in California, HGTV, $1 million house. You don't make $5,000 for a tenant fee because you placed a tenant. It might be $100 or maybe $200 or maybe 1% of the first month's rent or something pretty low. But you're doing it so that you can have the relationship, because now maybe in a year when they're ready to buy something, you stay in touch, they're going to use you to buy that thing. And in the process, in the meantime, maybe they're so thankful that you helped them find the rental that they refer other business to you. So there's more reasons to work for somebody than just the paycheck you're getting. It's all about building that relationship. Okay, we hanging in there? I've had to talk a lot about this stuff, so if you need to stand up and shake it out, get a little bit of blood running through the veins, I understand. Hang in there. Okay. Fiduciary. Real estate commission. In the real estate manual, which is a big blue book that you use when you take your post classes, says that a fiduciary is someone acting in a position of trust, like an executor of an estate, or an attorney, or a guardian, a legal guardian for an underage person, or a broker. All of those are examples of people with fiduciary responsibilities. You're standing in the place of your client, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you can't sign a contract on behalf of your client when you're a broker in real estate. You could as an attorney, but a broker's, that's not the level of this fiduciary we're talking about, but you still are representing your client, and you're the one that the other agent's going to interact with, And then you'll tell your client what the offer was or what the counter offer was, and you'll help them negotiate. But it's not your client talking to the other agent, it's the agents talking to each other. Agents meaning humans in this case. Let me just use a different word, broker or licensee. So when you have a fiduciary level of responsibility, you have a duty to look out for your client's best interest above the other one and anyone else, right? Including your own, by the way. We've got to put our client's best interest above our own. Sometimes that could result in you making less money or maybe no money if things don't go great. It's not a regular thing, but it's got to be that the client's best interests are first. Our duty is to protect them, even sometimes from themselves. Sometimes they talk about wanting to do something, and you have to say, you could get sued over that. Are you sure you want to do that? Talk to an attorney about what the ramifications, what the consequences of that choice might be. So we need to tell the clients not what they want to hear, but what they need to hear. Sometimes they get mad at us for it, right? Sometimes they get mad enough that they don't want to work with us anymore, but you need to have that relationship so that they are getting honest advice from you, not something that benefits you more than them. For instance, remember, willful misrepresentation. One example of that was telling them the house is worth $250,000 because you knew that that's what it's going to take for them to actually hire you, but knowing full well it will never sell for that because you have the research in place. That would be you telling them what they want to hear instead of what they need to hear. This fiduciary thing is huge. Representing clients in complex financial transactions. Many times it's the biggest dollar amount somebody's ever going to deal with. The average client, I think this number is going to go up. The average client buys or sells every 5 to 7 years. This has been a long-standing National Association of Realtors statistic. But I think after these last couple of years, that number is going to turn into like 8 to 10 or maybe 12 to 15. I don't think people are going to be buying and selling quite as often as they were. If they bought at the top of the market, they're probably going to have to stick in that house a little longer. But still, they're not doing it too much. Even at that level, they're doing it less than you are. Even if you sell one per month, you've done 12 in a year, and they've done maybe 6 in their whole life, right? So we as agents do this more times than they do. So they need somebody who knows how to do it. And finally, if you weren't already wondering, here's the answer to what are these fiduciary duties? Fiduciary duties are these 6, as remembered by the acronym OLD CAR. Good old, I think that's a 57 Chevy maybe. OLD CAR stands for obedience. I'm going to get into each one of these. Obedience, we owe our client obedience and loyalty, and we owe them disclosure. We have to tell them what's wrong with properties. We also owe them confidentiality. They need to be able to confide in us. That buyer needs to be able to tell us, okay, Neil, let me offer $380, but if I have to go to $400, I will. And because you're his buyer agent, you're not going to tell the other party clearly that he'll go to $400. You would never, and I've heard this before, guys. I've heard agents walk all over this because they're so worried about the deal falling through. They break these rules. I've heard an agent bring me an offer and they say, well, Neil, they'll offer $480, but if that's not what it takes, if we need to go a little higher, I think I can make it happen. And I'm like, you are not a great agent for your client. You gotta like bulk up a little bit. You gotta, as much as you might want to, you would need to say, they're offering $480. What? $480? That's crazy. Sometimes agents get emotional and sometimes they burn your ears off in the phone. And that's a poor agent. When someone does that, they might. But don't try to sugarcoat it. Don't say, oh, well, I'm sorry, $480, but I think I can go higher. You just violated the fiduciary relationship because you just told them that $480 is not the real number, right? So keep that confidentiality. And accounting, we have to be responsible for some money. We're dealing with both earnest money and due diligence money. And we're also dealing with sensitive documents. So we got to account for those things. And then finally, we owe everybody, clients and customers, reasonable skill and care. We need to know what we're doing, which forms to use, where to fill in the blanks, how to do it, how to do this business. So, out of all 6 of these, we owe our client all 6. We owe the customer on the other side of the transaction the last 2 letters of each word, right? We owe them disclosure and reasonable skill and care, right? So obedience. The agent owes the client lawful obedience. That's the testable item here under obedience. We can't just do anything they tell us to, because sometimes they might either on purpose or accidentally tell us to do something illegal. Now, it might be that it's a fair housing law because either they're a big jerk, big prejudice, bigot jerk, or they just don't know the rules. Now, how could that be? It could be that they say, I don't want to sell my house to this group of people that look like this. Clearly a problem, clearly breaking the law. That'd be a terrible position to be in. Hopefully, before you got to that position, you've explained to them, look, guys, here's how all this works. We don't care what anybody looks like, where they came from, what they believe in. Real estate needs to be fairly accessible to everyone. Therefore, whoever makes an offer, you're going to make a decision based on the money, right, and the terms, not the people. Let them know where you stand with that so that they don't think, well, she looks just like me, so she must have my same prejudices. Let's not even go there, because that'd be terrible for them to expose themselves and you then to have to decide to not work with them because you don't want to work with them, but you've already put work in, right? Sometimes, though, they don't know any better. They think, well, they don't understand the fair housing rules and laws about, why don't you advertise that it's only a block away from the Jewish Community Center? I think that's a good sales tactic. I'm sorry, I can't do that, Mr. Seller, because that's a violation of the religion category under fair housing, which we'll get to in Unit 19, by the way. Can't talk about that. You couldn't say listing is only a block from the Jewish Community Center. You could say from the community center, but you got to leave the religion part out of it. Well, this is a neighborhood. It's a single level house. It'd be great for somebody with no kids. That's another protected class. It's called familial status. They don't know any better, so you need to educate them. Look, we can't do that. We can't advertise that way because that's a violation of fair housing rules and laws. So we have to obey their wishes, but only their lawful wishes. Loyalty, we are hired by them, so we're loyal to them, right? We are their person. We need to disclose any relationships we might have with people, whoever's involved in the transaction, right? We are loyal to them at the exclusion of everyone else, including ourselves. We're loyal to them even above our own self. We got to put their needs over our own. If we want to buy our seller's house, we might walk through that listing as we're thinking we're going to list it for sale, but we realize I want to buy it. Well, you would have to tell them. You'd have to stop everything the minute you realize this, give them full disclosure. Look, I might be your buyer. Stop telling me things. Don't tell me the least you might be willing to take, because I might be the buyer for your house. And we can't represent any adverse interest, anything that's adverse to the client's needs without their permission. That might be maybe the buyer wants to buy your listing so they can use it for a rental, and that buyer somehow reaches out to you, I don't know, maybe through social media, and they say, look, if you can talk your seller into taking my offer, then I'll hire you as my property manager when I rent my property out. You would need to disclose to your seller this thing. You certainly can't engage in this. Your seller would have to know. Sometimes agents, when they call you with an offer, they say, I've emailed the offer. By the way, what can you tell me about the situation? Sometimes they'll start chatting. They'll start telling you more. They'll say, well, you know, they're coming in with this price, but they really like the house. They really don't want to lose it. We've lost 3 in a row. So if we need to make it a little stronger, or they might say, something about their motivation, something about their timeline. So you have to be real careful. And if there's any sort of adverse interest that you could gain at their at their expense, you'd have to disclose that. Along similar lines, if the seller's offering a bonus, like an agent bonus to you, you would need to tell your buyer, look, hope you buy this one because I'll get a bonus. Just laugh it off, right? But make sure before they fall in love with it and make an offer on it, they know that you stand to make more money on this house than the other house, so that they don't ever look back and say, she was really pushing hard for me to take this one, not that one, and now I see why, because she made more money on this one. You don't ever want that to be a thing, right? If the client gives a lawful instruction that could result in injury to them, we need to tell them and encourage them to talk to an attorney. So I had a listing one time, and it took a long time to get the tenant out of there. It was actually her future son-in-law. He was terrible to her, and he would not leave, and he was not paying rent anymore. And the daughter and her mom were not getting along. It was just a sad situation for like 9 months, only a few years ago. Listed it in November. We actually went under contract in January, but it was a mess. The house was a mess. But that buyer knew, look, it's so hard to find something for sale that I'm just going to stick it out. And hopefully they'll get this guy evicted. They tried several times, went to court 3 different times, couldn't get him out because partly the COVID restrictions too. Finally, he left. And he left, and it was great news because now the buyer could actually buy it. We could close because we had been waiting for this month after month. And my seller said, well, Neil, it's been 9 months since I put this on the market. Now I want more money. I know we negotiated this price back in January, but now it's July, and this house is worth more than what we have agreed to sell it for, so I'm not selling. I want more money. Renegotiate. And I'm like, we can't do that. We've already done that. You would be literally breaching the contract. We'll learn about that in 9 and 10. So, Mrs. Seller, if you want to back out, that's a seller breach, which means they could come after you for everything they've spent on inspections, plus earnest money, plus due diligence money, plus sue you for specific performance. I don't care. I'm leaving money on the table. I thought you were here to represent me and look out for me. I am. That's why I'm telling you this is against the law, against the rules. This is breach of contract. What you need to do is call the real estate attorney. Let me give you somebody to talk to. Find out from them the consequences of breaching the contract. I had to give her that advice. She ended up backing off the ledge. She was like, okay, let's just get it over with. And she went through with it. But she would have been in big trouble. And I needed to point her to an attorney, because that's legal advice that I was not either allowed nor willing to give. We owe them disclosure. We have to tell them about material facts which affect the value and the marketability of the property. We have to tell them of all offers. We have to give people all offers, any offer that comes in. And that might sound like, well, sure, of course you do. Why would you have to even tell me that? Well, what if the seller received like 14 offers on their house? That's not unusual. And then to the point where on Friday they say, you know what, I'm exhausted from all these offers. Let's tell everybody that on Saturday at noon, I'm done. Bring any offers you want to by noon tomorrow, and I'm going to pick one of them. Well, let's say that Saturday noon rolls around and comes and goes, and now it's Saturday at 1:30 p.m., and you get 3 more offers. What do you do as the listing agent? You still present them. You have to present all offers, even ones that happen after a deadline. Doesn't matter. They might even tell you, don't even show them. I'm sorry, I have to. The law requires it. I'm going to send them to you. You don't have to look at them, but I've got to present them to you. Because, by the way, they could be the better offer, worth looking, and they could still choose it. Even though they told everybody the deadline was noon, that doesn't mean they made the decision by noon. That just meant offers are due by noon, but they would still have the legal right to take one that came in after that deadline. So you've got to present all offers to them. And remember that these are other material fact things, the ability of the parties to perform, the identity and ability of the parties to complete the transaction. You've got to disclose that. If you're a listing agent and you find out that buyer didn't qualify for the loan was denied, obviously you'd have to tell your seller ASAP. If you're the buyer's agent and you find out that your buyer client's loan no longer or didn't go through, didn't get approved, then you would need to disclose that to the other party ASAP. Any sort of material facts that matter to them. That's the yellow one at the bottom. Does your buyer have some personal vendetta against termites, and they don't want to buy a house that has ever had any termites in it ever, but the least little bit of termite damage shows up and they decide not to buy it? Well, that's a material fact to them, and you owe them that disclosure. There's several different disclosure forms that we use. The main one about the property itself is this one. It's called a residential property disclosure form. The acronym is RPOADS, RPOADS. And it's a 4-page form. And I'll provide that for you in the Google Drive, but you'll be able to look through it. The first page just identifies the rules and then also the parties and the property. The second, third, and fourth pages talk about the condition of the property and if it has a homeowners association. So here's the thing you need to know on the test about this disclosure form. We as agents cannot fill it out for them. We can certainly answer questions about it and guide them through it, but we can't put pen to paper for them. Can't fill it out for them. And you can see even this, if that's a full size piece of paper, that's a pretty small font. Some people with vision problems might have trouble with this, but as much as you feel sorry for them, you can't fill it out for them. They need to, in one case, I knew that they called their adult daughter to come over, and the agent wasn't able to fill it out, but the daughter did. She came over, filled it out. The agent talked them through it, said, here's what this means. That's what they're asking here. What is it? Is it plastic? Is it PVC? Is it this or that? The other thing is that a seller has to provide this disclosure form to the buyer, or the buyer has an excuse to walk away if they want to. So if the seller does not provide this disclosure form by the time an offer is made, then the buyer has 3 days from the point they get the form. Finally, they have 3 days to back out if they want to. That's just built in. That's how important this form is. Now, the other thing about this form that we'll get more into, on the other pages, I don't have one in front of me. I'll show it to you when I find it. There are 3 choices. The various questions ask about different parts, systems of the property. So does the roof leak? There's a checkbox. Yes, it leaks. Or no, it doesn't leak. But then there's a third box, and that box is labeled no representation. No representation. Basically, I'm not telling one way or the other, either because I don't know or because I just don't want to tell. That's the loophole that a seller has. So a seller has to provide this form, but this form could be a whole bunch of no representation checks. They're not telling anything with the form, but they provided the form. The catch here is if the seller tells you, their listing agent, that the roof leaks, and then they try to check no representation on the form, you still have to tell everybody, right? Because they told you, the broker, so you owe that disclosure to everyone. It's not going to do them any good to check no representation, although they still can, but you have to tell the world that they told you that the roof leaks. So, got to tell them, explain how all this works when you're going through this. We'll get into this in Unit 8, and we'll see those check boxes. Got to keep their secrets, private information, including their motivation, and we can tell their confidential information, but only if they give us permission to. Maybe they would give us permission to tell everybody that they're extra motivated because they want to encourage offers to come in. That will be a confidential piece of information that they gave you permission to disclose because they felt, well, benefits me. Maybe I'll get offers to come in if they know that I'm willing to come maybe lower than what they assume I would. So you can disclose confidential information if you have their permission. We owe them accounting, maintaining records of transactions, taking care of the money. So we have to keep, as brokers and firms, both broker and firm, got to keep copies of our transactions, all the records associated with every transaction for 3 years, right? So got to keep it. It can be written, it can be printed out, but it could also be electronic. It could be on a zip drive or on a cloud service, but you probably want some redundancy. You just want to be able to produce all the documents of a transaction within 3 years. If the commission ever came along and said, hey, we need to see this from 2 years ago when you had this sale, show us the buyer agency form out of this. You better have it, right? You got to have all records of all transactions for 3 years back. So that's a constantly evolving thing. If you want to be super efficient, maybe every year you weed out that previous oldest year so that you're maintaining but you could keep all of them if you want. But a minimum of 3 years, that's a testable item. Keep your records for 3 years. Got to keep the client's money, like the earnest money, in a separate account from the firm's operating account. Otherwise, you're guilty of commingling. We talked about that, I think, in license law. And then as a provisional broker, you have an elevated responsibility for the money. You can't hold it in a file. Like if you get a check from your client for earnest money or due diligence, you can't just stick it in the file folder and walk around with it. The minute you get any check from your client for an offer like that, you've got to turn it into your broker in charge. If you're non-provisional, it could actually be in your possession for a couple of days, and that's okay. But as a provisional, there's no such thing. Hot potato game, right? You can't hold people's money. Got to give it to the BIC or the seller if it's due diligence money ASAP. Let's come back from a break. I'll see you in 10.
smart pair that. And then I'll pan down here. Goodness gracious. All right, you ready? Here we go. Pan down. There you go on the floor. There's the boxes. So this is what the mic setup is doing underneath that stool. Oh, the stool's in the way. Here, I'll move it. Okay. There you go. There it is, Rob. Those are the Soyuz boxes. So each mic's going into those boxes, and then they run around the floor. Wrong way. Then they run around the floor up here. Rob, listen, man, between you and my buddy Darrell, the way y'all set up studios is like fire, man. And so they run around here to the floor and right over here. I couldn't find a way to hide these stupid wires here without messing up the table. So I just let the colors just let me see. Do I have a tight shot on this one? Nope. I don't have a tight shot on that one. Sorry. Go back to the jib. Oh, you need to work that. Okay. So back to the jib shot. It's on the jib shot. But so these cords are just going to hang here until I figure out something to do on that. But honestly, now I actually can have 6 mics running, because the other 2, if I just unmute it on the desk, they're on. But I guess 6 people talking in the room when the mic is a lot. What would you say?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to let you.
Especially all at once.
Huh?
Especially all at once. But it wouldn't be as bad as the 5th grade cafeteria, because
Wait, hit that button right there. Yep. How about that? Now you got that sound.
There's about like 124 kids screaming in there.
Welcome to the last little bit, the last hour of the evening. Not even that. Talking about agency. Any questions? It's kind of a weird topic, guys, and a lot of room for questions, for testable items, I should say. So we've been talking about the fiduciary responsibilities that we have for our clients. We're almost through it. So the only thing left is accounting and reasonable skill and care. Accounting means we have a responsibility to take care of their funds. It also means any sort of compensation or bonuses or incentives need to be reported to our client. We owe that information to our client. We can't keep it a secret that we're getting paid more than what they think, right? So if a builder is paying us a bonus for maybe getting under contract on their model home by the end of the month, we would need to tell our client that. There's one issue related to our compensation that we do not owe to our client. There's one thing that we don't have to tell our client. And what that is whatever our commission split would be with our firm. How much of a split do we have with our firm? What is our firm paying us? Is our firm giving us 50-50 or 70-30? That is not our client's business. But what is their business is how much the firm is making. The total to the firm is their business, or both firms, right? Buyer's firm and seller's firm, but not how much the split is once the firm shares with the agent that is in their firm, right? That is not their right to know. And then finally, reasonable skill and care. Do we know what we're doing? Right? We're going to get trained, hopefully, by our broker in charge, by maybe there's a mentor, maybe there's a coach. That's why, as a provisional, you need to be real tight with that BIC to make sure you have this part down. Know what forms to use, know how to do this stuff. And it's a little scary because so much of what you learn in this business is not out of a class or a book, but from pure experience and on-the-job training. We could have a responsibility for helping both sides in the transaction, because by helping, maybe it's our buyer that we're representing. We're a buyer's agent, but they want to buy a house that's sold by the owner, a for sale by owner. There's no other agent besides us, but we don't owe anything to that seller. We owe all of our fiduciary responsibility to our buyer. However, the seller needs some help because they don't know how to do this stuff as well as you do, because you do it all the time. So therefore, there are some things we would need to do for that seller, even though they are not our client, because by helping them, we're helping our client achieve their goal of buying the house, right? So that's what this means. Sometimes, quite often, we actually have to help the other side while not violating the loyalty, the confidentiality, the obedience of our own client, but just to help facilitate the transaction so as to benefit our client. And then our duties don't end once we go under contract. Under contract means the contract is signed, but we haven't closed yet. There's still a lot to happen between contract signing and closing day. And so we're not done unless maybe you're on a team and you're handing it off to a transaction coordinator, but still your legal responsibilities are to your client all the way through closing. So reasonable skill and care. We have duties to our clients, but we also have some duties to the other side. And so if you think about that whole relationship of you and your client with the other agent and their client, think of it as like a volleyball or a tennis court. And we've got the net down the middle, right? So we've got a buyer's agent helping their buyer. To that buyer's agent, the buyer to the buyer agent is the client, but the seller to the buyer agent is their customer. We owe two things to the customer. Even the agents on one side of the fence owe something to the principal on the other side, and it's the last letter of both words in the acronym Old Car. We owe them disclosure of material facts, and we owe them honesty and fairness. That's it. That's it. We owe to our client all of Old Car. To the customer, we owe them honesty, fairness, and disclosure. By the way, brokers have to disclose material facts to everyone. We owe those to the whole world. The guy at the grocery store, even that person. Everyone voluntarily. We have to voluntarily give out that information, no matter who we represent. This material facts are for the whole world to know. How do we do that? How would a broker disclose material facts? The broker is not allowed to fill out the disclosure form. Only the seller is allowed to do that. Therefore, what method would the broker use? How's the broker going to, you tell me in the chat, how would a broker tell the world that the roof leaks, that there's mold, that there's radon gas? You got it. There you go. On the MLS, right? We can't touch the disclosures, but we can certainly report it in the remarks section of the MLS. We could add an attachment to the MLS where we talk about such things. Maybe we provide a structural engineer's report, something like that. You know, sometimes it gets quite often to be a little interesting, because if you have a deal that falls through because the seller wouldn't fix the items that were requested to be fixed, well, here's the process. The buyer has the inspections done. They maybe hire a general inspection, and then that general inspector says, I'm seeing evidence of mold, so therefore you should have a mold specialist. And I got a reading of radon, so you probably need to get a quote on radon remediation. The inspector's report is going to be gone over between the buyer and buyer agent. They're going to talk about it. They're going to say, which of these items that the inspector found that need repair do we want to ask for? And so based on the conversation, the buyer's agent's going to prepare a due diligence request, basically saying, hey, we want you to fix items 3, 5, 7, and 9 and give us money in place of number 10, whatever it might be. Well, let's just say the seller says, I'm not fixing anything. Have you not heard? This is a seller's market. Take your report and go somewhere else. But they might, in the course of asking for those repairs, send the report to the seller so they can see the pictures of what's wrong. Well, now the seller knows. And that's not as important as the next thing. Now the agent knows, has seen that report, because there was an agent who sent it to the other agent. Now the broker knows all the material facts that were made, that were revealed by the inspection, and they have an obligation to disclose. So if the deal falls through because the seller won't fix that leaky roof, well, that broker better update the MLS sheet, because now they know a lot more material facts than they did the first time around. And quite often brokers don't do it, but they could get in trouble if it came down to it, if there was a complaint made. So, in fact, in the CE course this year that we're teaching, I think, what was it? The stat said 55% of all the disciplinary actions that the commission has had to rule on were related to material facts. Isn't that crazy? 55% out of all the possible things somebody could do wrong, over half of them had to do with that one topic of mishandling material facts. Oh, so there you go. The way to disclose those material facts would be like comments in the MLS and other sorts of attachments. What are material facts? 4 main categories. And we've seen some of these, I think, in the license law and commission rules, but the property itself. What's wrong with the property itself? Leaky roof, mold, leaky plumbing, electrical's not working, the outlet doesn't work, or the area around the property, lower left there, number 2. There's a landfill nearby. There's a loud traffic pattern overhead because you're near an airport. Number 3 would be disclosing that the parties can't perform financially. The seller received a foreclosure notice in the mail. What if the seller is late on their mortgage payment, by the way? Tell me in the chat. Is that a material fact that the seller is 3 months behind on their mortgage? There you go. Good job. But once they get that foreclosure notice, then yes, that is a material fact that we must stop everything and go tell that buyer's agent, or the agent helping the buyer if it's a sub-agent. And then anything important to the principals. Number 4, it looks like maybe termites are important to the principal. Of course, number 4 could also be, that exact example could be a number 1 because it relates to the property itself. But if that buyer doesn't want to buy because a termite, even though it's been fixed, termite damage, but it's been fixed, that's important to them. And that's a material fact to them. There's some examples of about the property: radon, leaky plumbing, mold, broken window. Anything else that you can think of about the property? What sorts of things are material facts? Yeah, that's a good one. Ter-
Septic tanks.
Yep, there you go. That's a messy one.
Bad roof.
Yeah, leaky roof. What about things related to the property? What am I looking at here? What sorts of things matter because it's nearby? Not the property's not broken, but stuff nearby is affecting the property. No, that's a good one, Carrie. Yep, landfill. Carrie has recently finished space unpermitted. That would be a good one for number one. Termites. Yeah, that's another good one for number one. Things related to the property: zoning, landfill, noise issues. That lower right one is a hog farm. That would be really smelly. That's something that showed up in the continuing education course as a case study that actually happened in real life. The broker showed up, saw that the property, or smelled that the property was next door to a hog farm, and the seller said, I'm selling because I'm tired of that smell. Need to disclose it, right? Maybe that buyer shows up and their sinuses are stuffed and they can't smell it. Well, you better disclose it to them so when they get better and they don't discover a nasty surprise. Number 3, these are all things pertaining to the financial ability to perform: denial of a loan, foreclosure, or bankruptcy. Somebody's declaring bankruptcy. And then number 4, if it's important to them. Maybe it's important to them that there was once a fire. The fire's done, but maybe you open up a closet or go in a crawl space up in the attic and you see some burnt timbers and they didn't report it. Or a homeowners association, you definitely need to disclose what those rules are, covenants and restrictions. It was once flooded, would be important. And were there any pets? Because maybe the person has very sensitive pet allergies. Okay. Here are some material facts that, even if they're repaired or replaced, still have to be disclosed. The first one is this. When I got in the business, this EIFS, EIFS, synthetic stucco, I never remember what that acronym stands for, but EIFS type of stucco, it's not the real hard coat stucco that you see in California and Florida. It's a different version. It's built differently. The hard coat stucco, actually, if you look at that blue thing in the middle, between what they call the substrate and the stucco is actually airspace when it's hard coat. And so if moisture were to get back there, maybe over the top of the window or at a door, and there's a crack in the stucco siding and moisture gets in the rain, there would be an airspace for it to go down and ventilate and get dried out. But this is synthetic stucco, and there is no airspace here. It is solid material from the studs of the wall to the sheathing to the reinforcing mesh to the actual stucco. If water gets back in a synthetic stucco house through a crack, it's going to just stay there longer and rot from the inside out. It's like house cancer. You see those pictures around it. That's what that looks like over time. Could end up being mold as well as water damage. Therefore, even if somebody has synthetic stucco, maybe they had a water problem, maybe they had one of these nightmare situations, and they had the money to just take all the stucco off and brick it up instead. And it's no longer a stucco house. Now it's a full brick house. But just because it once upon a time had stucco, they still have to disclose it. Synthetic stucco, even if repaired or replaced, is a material fact that must be disclosed, even if it is no longer there or a problem, even if it's repaired. Yes, disclosure also applies to leasing. Somebody put that in the chat. That's in a direct message if you didn't see it. So synthetic stucco, even if repaired, is still a material fact that must be disclosed. How do you know? Hopefully the seller will tell you. What if the seller is not the one who actually replaced it? You do your best, right? You might see some hints or red flags. Maybe the windows are inset differently because, it's hard to put different siding thickness over something once something is built. You take off a thinner siding and put brick. Sometimes it looks weird. It might be that you could, if you have a paranoid enough client that's really asking, maybe the whole neighborhood is largely synthetic stucco, and so you're thinking, well, I wonder if this ever was. There's a way to look back in the insurance records and see if there was ever a large claim against the property. It is something called a CLUE report. It's an acronym, stands for Comprehensive Loss Underwriting Exchange. And it's a thing that the insurance agents can go look up, and you as an owner of a property can get a free one every year, just like a free credit report. But it's a CLUE report for whatever large underwriting insurance claims might have been made against a property. When your buyer's buying something, that might be some standard that you ask as a buyer agent. You say, hey, seller's agent, listing agent, could you provide the CLUE report? So my buyer's curious about any large insurance claims that might have been made. Not a normal course of action, but it's certainly possible to as something that could be asked for. But that might be a way to figure this out too. Maybe this shows up in that CLUE report. Another material fact, there's 3 of these, by the way. We're on the second one, it's this gray pipe. The gray stuff is probably something called polybutylene piping. It was used in the 80s and 90s. Anybody ever heard of polybutylene? PB. It was, if you look in a crawl space or maybe in the walls or up in the attic, you'll see this gray stuff. Sometimes instead of that copper fitting that you see, it's actually more gray stuff. So the fittings are polybutylene as well as the pipes. The problem is water, like the chlorine chemicals in the water, could actually break down the poly and cause leaks. And if you get a little pinhole leak like this in a place where you don't notice it for a while, it just eats up, right? It just gets soggy and could get moldy, could start to rot, and just really cause a huge problem. So what the material fact is would be polybutylene pipes that have ever leaked. So what is not a material fact is polybutylene pipes themselves. If they've never leaked, that is not a material fact. But if they have leaked, then that is a material fact, whether they're fixed, repaired, replaced, or not. If they once upon a time leaked but don't anymore, you still have to report it. But if it's just poly piping in the house, as long as they've never leaked, you don't have to report it. It's not a material fact. So poly pipes that have leaked is the material fact. Synthetic stucco, even if it's been repaired or replaced, still has to be reported. And then finally, my favorite one is Breaking Bad, Walter White, meth house. If they ever used the house to produce methamphetamine, because that stuff releases toxins that get into the building materials like the sheetrock and the carpet and the vents, and that toxic substance can be breathed in way after the fact and show up in a drug test. There was an example, there was a sad story of a pregnant lady who was renting a house, and somehow or other she had a blood test done, maybe through her OBGYN stuff, and it showed that she tested positive for meth. And there she was getting in trouble because clearly now we have a pregnancy, a child endangerment issue, and she swore that it wasn't her. She didn't do it. She didn't know why. It showed that. Come to find out, the place they were renting had the fumes, so to the point where her breathing in the fumes inside the house, even though it had been cleaned up, it was enough to show up in her bloodstream and show her as a positive meth user. Good news, the baby wasn't affected. They figured it all out. She didn't end up getting in trouble. I think they I guess they probably moved. What is the remediation for a meth house? Sometimes it never gets better. It just needs to be torn down. Sometimes maybe you could take all the sheetrock down to the studs. It depends, but it's not cheap. It's not easy. Therefore, a meth house, if the house ever was used to produce meth, must be disclosed. Again, how do you know? You may not. But if it comes out, people are potentially getting in trouble. Definitely big time safety issue there. We as brokers have some prohibited conduct issues. We saw a lot of this, and we even covered it yesterday, right? It's showing up here in chapter 7, but we've seen this already in license law and commission rules. Willful and negligent misrepresentation and omission. And whether through laziness or outright maliciousness, Are we disclosing things properly? Are we leaving stuff out? Are we saying the wrong thing? Those are all things that get us in trouble with disciplinary action. The willful part means the agent knew it. We've covered this already. The negligent part means we should have known it and we didn't bother to find out, or we were too lazy. And then the misrepresentation means we lied. The omission says we didn't say anything. So the best practice here, when you see a question like this, figure out the misrepresentation or omission part first. Was it this or that? Then go back and figure out, okay, did they do it on purpose, or did they do it just because they should have tried harder and they were lazy? We good on that? Guys are troopers. You're hanging in there. Okay. There are some issues that are not material facts, even though they might seem like they should be. Any guesses? What are we not required to disclose, but we might think we should? It's kind of a big deal. I think we've talked about it. What was that?
A death in the house?
Yes, there it is. There's one of them. Sex offender nearby, death in the house, suicide in the house.
Mold in the house unless it's over 1 square.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, it's not going to show up on this slide I'm about to share, but that's a good point. Good job remembering that. And then there's one more that applies to what we just had 2 weeks ago. Might be very timely for October 31st. We are not required to disclose the presence of ghosts in the house. These are all under the category of stigmatized property, right? Death or suicide, sex offender nearby, haunted house, not material facts, therefore do not require disclosure. If you know about it as the broker, you could choose to basically plead the fifth. If they ask you about it, you could say, I'm not replying to that. That might not help the situation, but if they ask you, you definitely can't say, no one's ever died here, if in fact you know that they did. You can't lie about it. You could abstain, but you can't lie about it. Oh, and then a little caveat to the death or suicide. We're going to learn in chapter 19 that there are 7 federally protected classes. Familial status, meaning underage children. Race, religion, sex, which includes gender identity, sexual orientation, male, female, handicap, color, and national origin. Out of all of those, handicap, also known as disability, is something you can't discriminate against someone over. If they're in that group of a disability, a disabled person, can't discriminate, can't not sell something to a person, can't refuse to show them property just because it's inconvenient to deal with a wheelchair or whatever, right? Well, along the lines of the disabled category of the federally protected classes is HIV and AIDS. If somebody died from HIV or AIDS in the house and a person asks you about that and they say, hey, did anybody ever die of AIDS in here? You are not allowed to answer that, period. Because that would be violating the disability category of fair housing laws. So if it's an HIV or AIDS reason for death, you can't talk about that at all, even if you know it, because it would be a violation of fair housing. Okay, let's have a little pop quiz. 3 days after closing, the buyer finds out that the seller's son committed suicide in the basement. The agent never disclosed this fact, and the buyer is furious. What remedies are available to the buyer?
Well, for the first question, I guess there's like nothing they can do about it. It's not a, like for them, like they just can't do anything about it.
You
They
got
just
it.
have to stay with the house. But if they died, because of HIV, I mean they also can't say anything, right?
Right. They definitely can't say anything if it's HIV or AIDS, right? If it's just a death or suicide in and of itself, they could tell if they chose to, but they're not required to. None of these cases makes any of this a material fact. It's kind of what we're getting back around to. So good job. What are some other things that brokers can and can't do? We know we need to account for funds. We know we need to act competently. We have to deliver all offers no matter when, even after deadlines. Even, by the way, what if your listing, your seller has accepted an offer and now we are under contract? Maybe it's been a week and it's been under contract for a week, and another 3 or 4 weeks we're going to close, and you get an offer. What if you get an offer for an under contract listing? What do you have to do? Sounds silly, but you still present it, right? Because why? Well, your current offer could fall through, for that matter. And maybe that backup offer, that offer that came in, could become a backup offer, an official backup offer. If something is made a backup offer, that means we're using what's called a backup offer addendum. I know, mind blowing. And with that document, it means that that secondary offer is going to automatically rise to the primary position if the current offer falls through for some reason. So you've got an automatic replacement in place because that secondary buyer wants it so bad that they're going to just wait. So we would that's why it might be worth it for your seller to end up having, and they might kind of wish that they could take the backup offer, but they have to wait for that primary one to either work or not work. But they might want to at least have it as a backup plan. And then any commission we're earning, no matter from who, bonuses, whatever, commissions from third parties, we have to disclose to our clients. We can't make false promises. We need to come through with the promises we make. We have to disclose any sort of conflicts of interest. Tell them that we might be representing the other party on some other thing, and therefore our advice to our client might be tainted because we're trying to make sure that they buy that, they sell it to that particular buyer, because they're going to hire us to do the property management later in our earlier example. And then there's a nice big blanket provision that says no improper conduct allowed. So we can't act improperly. What are the consequences? We could end up dealing with any of these things. First and foremost, if it's a license law or commission rule violation, the real estate commission could discipline us. What are the ways that the real estate commission could discipline us?
They can suspend
Yep.
license or revoke.
Mm-hmm. Good. Suspend and revoke are the two most serious ones. What are the other ones?
Reprimand.
You got that right. Yep. Reprimand and censure. You got it. Good job. Reprimand and censure are the two lightest ones. They're kind of like slap on the wrist, note in the file. And now that you have sort of a reference and we've gone through some of this stuff, let's look back through the bulletin. And look at some of these things now that they mean more to you. So we have a reprimand on this first one. They were reprimanded for what? They acted as a buyer agent for a client in the purchase of residential property. This person was not present at the time of the inspection. Multiple areas of dampness were noted. The inspector was not able to fully inspect the walls because of personal property. Failed to advise his clients to further investigate about the water intrusion. And after closing, buyers discovered that repair of the issues could be in between $9,000 and $22,000. They ended up selling the property for a profit without making the repairs, but they disclosed the issue to the new buyer. So it looks like they bought it and then immediately sold it because of the issues, but the agent ended up getting reprimanded over it. That was probably about the easiest outcome they could have hoped for. In this case, the commission took a voluntary surrender of the license. When that happens, we never find out what the problem was, because the party doesn't have to admit anything or deny. The next one was a suspension. We see a lot of suspensions. They suspended the license for 6 months, starting February, and they found that back in 2021, they got into a buyer agency agreement where he agreed to share half of his commission with the buyer client, failed to inform all interested parties, and failed to pay the commission that was promised. There's our promise. Failed to fulfill a promise. And failed to review the disclosure that explains how agency works. We're going to see that in Chapter 8. It's called the Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure, and it's required that we get that signed off by the potential client. It's because it's proof that we explain to them how this whole thing works, how a seller can have an agent, how a buyer can have an agent, and how we could also have dual agency. They didn't review it. I'll bet this happens a lot, because I ask another question in CE classes. I'll ask all the agents, how many times do you meet a potential client and you explain the working with agents disclosure to them, and they say, I've never heard of this before ever. I've talked to 5 agents before you, and none of them mentioned this at all. And a lot of people raise their hand, because a lot of agents aren't doing this right. That's why it was a section in the continuing education course last year. It was an entire section. It's this year. It's a new development because we changed the paperwork around a little bit to make it a little easier to understand. And I'll be showing that to you in the next chapter. Here's another reprimand. They issued a letter requiring the tenant to vacate within 10 days instead of the required 30 days. When we get to rentals, we'll learn about the required amounts of notice. And then there was a civil complaint made against the person where he had to pay the tenant $2,400. He refused to pay. Is it a he? Sorry. Yeah. Pay the judgment until after the tenant filed the complaint with the commission. So here's a helpful hint. If you go ahead and take care of your mistake, you might be able to avoid it becoming a complaint with the commission. If he had gone ahead and paid that judgment, might not have ever had any commission disciplinary action that happened. Another reprimand. Let's see. Another reprimand. Failed to deliver that working with agents brochure again. A lot of reprimands this month. Oh, that's the same one. In this case, it was one of them was probably the firm, and the other was probably the human, because there's a firm license and there's also a human license. They both show up as the same issue. Oh, here's one about the suspension being stayed. The person was suspended for 6 months, but the commission said, but you can still practice as long as you do some stuff. And what they did wrong was didn't measure the property. We've got to measure. We're going to see how to measure later on. Didn't measure and advertised it as having 1,541 square feet, which was exactly the size listed in the tax records. That's really, really foolish, right? That's a big no-no. If you're going to not measure, don't put the exact number that you got out of the tax record. That's a huge red flag that you didn't measure, right? The odds of you measuring it to the exact number as the tax record are pretty slim. So they kind of told on themselves. That was the wrong way to handle that. They should have measured it or paid for someone else to measure it. Oh, look, the property had actually 1,261 square feet. The property had 22% less square footage than what was reported. The maximum wiggle room there is about 5 that you might get away with. So pretty big difference. And then the buyer found out about the difference in size during the under contract phase. Another suspension, this time for 24 months. They stayed the suspension again, and probably because the person had to take some classes maybe or do something to get better so they don't ever make the mistake again. Gosh, this one gets pretty elaborate. Unlicensed firm took over property management for vacation rental, did not include the required anti-discrimination language. Any sort of agency agreement, as we'll see in Chapter 8, must have the language which is related to federal fair housing. We're not going to discriminate on the basis of these protected classes. Didn't have that language in their agreement. Didn't maintain the trust account properly. That's another one that pops up from time to time. If you're maintaining a trust account, they come in and audit it from time to time and make sure that you're handling other people's money properly, and he didn't. This person didn't. And then finally, a reprimand. Bought some properties subject to existing mortgages. What does that mean? It means you're buying the property and agreeing to keep paying the seller's mortgage payment. And it might be that the lender, if they ever found out about that the seller is not, that they actually sold to you and you're not the original one that they made the loan to, that could trigger a due on sale clause. We'll get into all that later. Let's see. Failed to disclose in writing the effects of the due on sale clause to the seller, right? And they just needed to tell the seller what the possible downsides of subject to existing mortgage situation might be. What could happen is the seller could have been foreclosed. The bank could have said, we didn't agree to loan money to this person that you sold to. Therefore, we don't want them to make the payment to us. We want you to make the payment to us. Therefore, you owe us the whole loan balance now, immediately, due on sale. We consider you to be selling the property. Therefore, pay us off. We don't like, and a lot of times lenders don't want to this due on sale, or sorry, this subject to the existing mortgage situation for that reason. Okay, closing in. Here we go. So we are subject to discipline. We're also subject to getting sued. Anybody can get sued. That's civil suits. We're also sometimes subject to criminal prosecution. Not in every case, but some of these cases. What do sellers have to do in this agency relationship? Sellers have to act in good faith. They have to do what they say they're going to do. Or they could be they could breach, right? They're responsible for paying the agent. What if they don't pay the agent? Well, you could either let it go or you could sue them. But that's a pretty tough business decision. Do you want to be that agent who sues their clients? Maybe. You might want to be that because the deal falls through because the seller breaches and decides not to sell. And the buyer agent says, hey, I brought you a ready, willing, and able buyer. Your seller chose not to sell. You promised me, Mr. Listing Agent, you promised to pay me the commission that you're making. I want my commission. I did what I was supposed to do. When has an agent earned their commission? We're going to learn about that. It's not on closing day. Closing day is when we get the commission, but we've usually earned it a few weeks before that. Because what does it take to earn the commission? To produce a ready, willing, and able buyer. So if a buyer makes an offer and that offer is accepted by the seller, we have a ready and a willing buyer. But if they need to use a loan to buy it, they may not be able yet. We don't know if they're able until the loan has been approved. So if the deal falls apart before the loan is approved, then you're probably not going to be considered to have earned the commission because we didn't ever find out that the person was able, only that they were ready and willing. But once you do get that loan approval letter and then the seller were to breach and back out, then the commission is owed to the brokers. Then you do have a right to demand the commission. The seller's probably not going to give it to you because they're breaching on the transaction. Why wouldn't you think that they would? Why would you think they'd pay you too? So in that event, the buyer agent might say, I did my part. I'm demanding. They could sue you, the listing company, the listing firm, your firm. They could sue the firm for the buyer agency fee. And therefore, the firm is like, well, we're not just going to pay you a commission on something we never made. So therefore, in line like dominoes, the listing firm is sued by the buying firm. So the listing firm sues the seller who backed out. Says, we got to get the commission from you so that we can pay this party over here that's suing us. So you might kind of have to sue them against your will. Don't think it happens often. I'm knocking on this wood desk really hard, so it never happens. 26 years so far, not that big of a deal. Never gotten that far. But just know The agent has earned the commission before the closing day because it's ready, willing, and able buyer. That's what dictates having earned it or not. So you don't get paid when you've earned it. You've earned it probably a good ways before you actually get it. Oh, wow. Interesting. An agent in Clarksville, Tennessee that sues for commission. Is that a commercial broker or residential or either or both? See, I just don't want to live that life. But, you know, sometimes you got to make a stand. What's that mean? What do you mean, POG? Next thing, when it comes to this process, in North Carolina, there's a Latin phrase called caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. But it's not let the buyer beware of the agent, because agents have to disclose. It's let the buyer beware of the seller. Oh, thank you. Thanks for letting me know. Does it to military families. Wow, that's not cool. Let the buyer beware of the seller, because the seller can check no representation. It's therefore the buyer has the right to do any inspections, to go check it out and do their own due diligence. Hire whoever they want. They have that right. Therefore, the seller has the right to say, look, find it if you're going to find it, but I don't have to point out every little thing or any little thing. So, caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware of who? Not the broker, but of the seller, essentially. Because the buyer has the right to do their own searching and analysis and examination is a better word of the property. Okay, we've talked about buyer's agents and seller agents and dual agency, but let's back it out. Let's zoom out a little bit and look at all of agency, not just real estate related, but this thing. When it comes to types of agency, when we're talking about agency as this concept of a person representing another person, right? So in that situation, universal agency is sort of like how an attorney and a client to an attorney relationship is. That attorney can probably do about anything that the actual client could do. The attorney can sign contracts on behalf of their client if they're given that permission. They can negotiate on behalf of their client. They can say yes or no and obligate their client to that yes or no if they are given that permission. That's the highest level of agency. It's called universal, and it's like a power of attorney. It's the same thing. It doesn't have to be an attorney themselves, but you could give your best friend power of attorney for you, and then they could sign on behalf of you and accept and obligate you to things if you gave them that power. That's universal level of agency, the most responsibility. The middle one is called general agency, and that means that you don't have the full level of ability as you would as a universal, but you can still sign some things on behalf of your client. There are two areas in this business where general agency is taking place. One of them is how the broker signs the agency agreement on behalf of the firm. Remember, the last page of that agreement, whether it's a listing agreement or a buyer agency agreement, has only one signature. It's the broker's signature, never the broker in charge. It's not the firm's signature, just the person, the human broker who's doing it. Therefore, they have a general agency relationship. They can sign on behalf of their firm and get properties listed or get buyer agency forms signed. They do the signing. The firm trusts them to sign to sign those things on its behalf. And then finally, the other example of general agency is property management, because a property manager can actually sign things on behalf of their seller client for whom they are managing. They're going to be able to do the eviction process. They're going to be able to sign leases on their behalf. And then finally, what applies to the buying and selling side of the business is special agency. That's the lowest level. And that's what we do when we're helping somebody buy or sell. We never sign contracts on behalf of our client. But what we do is the old car, we have those responsibilities, just not anything more elaborate or serious than that. We have a special agency type. That's the lowest type. So the universal agent can do anything that the actual client or the principal can do. Any business, run the business for me for 3 months while I'm on vacation. No limits to authority. It's however many limits the client wants to give you. Could be either power of attorney, which could be anybody, or court order, which says the attorney, the court, the judge is putting so-and-so in charge of this person's affairs. There's our general agency, both for property management, finding and approving tenants, evicting tenants, the hiring staff, like if it's an apartment complex maybe, authorizing routine maintenance. All of those things a property manager does on behalf of their seller, owner, their owner client, because that owner doesn't want to deal with this. That's why they hired the property manager. And then the other kind of general agency is that independent contractor relationship between the broker and the firm. The broker is a sub-agent to the firm because the firm is the agent and the broker is the sub-agent. They can make some decisions for the firm. They can sign listing agreements, buyer agency agreements. They can negotiate those things for the firm on behalf of the firm. And they are in direct communication with the actual client. The firm is the agent. The sub-agent to the firm is the one that's interacting with that client. And then finally, special agent is what we do in sales. We can do specific acts just according to the client instructions. If the client, by the way, ever says, you know what I want for this property, just accept it for me. I don't want to deal with it. Just tell me that you did it. Sorry, I appreciate that you have that level of trust in me, but that's not how this works. I can't do that for you. I'll make it as easy as I can for you, but I'm a special agent. I can't sign things for you, but I can certainly walk you through it and make it as easy as possible. So it's the typical principal-client relationship in an agency agreement on the sales side of things. We have a lot more of 7 to go through. That's what we're going to do next week. And remember, that's just Wednesday night. We're off Thursday night for Thanksgiving, and then we'll pick it back up the next week. Let me know of any questions. Feel free to use that Notion. Put your name in the chat for me. And I hope you have a great weekend. I'll see you next week.